The Remarkable People Podcast. Check it out. The Remarkable People Podcast. Listen, do, repeat. For life.
Hello, friends. I'm David Pasqualone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Remarkable People Podcast, the Dr. David Harvitz story. Ladies and gentlemen, my mind is popping and moving, and it's hard for me to focus to make this intro because this is an amazing episode. If you're listening to this and you have physical pain, if you have been told for years, like we can't find what's wrong with you, or you're hypochondriac, or you're just, it's psychosomatic, this is the episode and a guest you really want to listen to and maybe get to know. The reason why I'm saying that is I was introduced to Dr. Dave through a mutual friend of ours and previous guest on the show, Gene Valentino. Gene spoke nothing but great things to Dave. Dave and I had some conversations. You're going to see, he went to the University of Philadelphia for his doctorate, which is a #1 PT school in the country, if not the world. You're going to see how he's a godly man and his journey on the way and how we can all glean from it and grow as men and women. So much packed in this episode, so much truth, so much knowledge. I'm super stoked for it. But then after we recorded the episode, I'm talking with one of my friends who's a massage therapist, and she made a passing comment about her back. And I'm like, what happened with your back? And she was like, yeah, I just thank God I can be here today doing my job. She's like, because just a year ago, I could barely function, and now I'm working full time again. I'm running, I'm living a full life. But just a year ago, I was ready to give it up and file disability. So I'm like, what happened? And she's like, 20 years ago, I was hit by a car 3 weeks after I had a baby. She's like, then shortly after that, I started getting white flashes, like whiteouts, where it looked like electricity was in my brain. It was coming from nerve damage. And she's like, I went like 8 or 9 years with that. And then I went to doctors, I went to physical therapists, I went to orthopedics. She's like, I went to chiropractors, and they either said, we don't know what's wrong, or there's nothing wrong, you're making it up. So she's like, I went another 9 years. So like basically a total of almost 20 years in pain. And she was just getting worse and worse and worse. And then she meets this physical therapist through referrals at her church, Dr. David. And she ends up, through another mutual friend, booking a meeting, the initial interview. They have that consultation. They meet 5 or 6 more times over the next 3 weeks. And she goes from near excruciating pain, where it's debilitating her, where she can't work, she can't live, she can't just be the way God made her to be, to she meets Dr. Dave, goes through his program. They work together for just 3 weeks. And now she's running again, working full time, has no pain. It's freaking incredible. And she's like, I thank God for Dr. Dave. She had no idea he was on my show. I had no idea about her story. But this is Dr. Dave. This is his story. These are his tips and process that not only for physical can help you grow, but listen to the content that God used in his life. It really is remarkable, and it'll help us all grow. So ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I am super proud and happy to bring you the Dr. David Harvitz story. Enjoy. This is David Pasqualone again, and I'm sorry I interrupted our flow, but I made a mistake. And I forgot something that's going to benefit you. Number one, the mistake. In the intro, I said the University of Philadelphia. I'm a goofball. It's the University of Pittsburgh. So University of Pittsburgh is where Dr. Dave got his doctorate, and that is one of the greatest schools for physical therapy in the US and the world. So the University of Pittsburgh, my sincerest apologies. Second, I got you all excited about this episode. You should be excited for this episode. And if you love the episode and feel God leading you, at the end of the episode, Dr. Dave has a special offer for you as part of a remarkable community to get your life kick-started and headed back to full. All right. I love you. Sorry for the mistakes. Enjoy this remarkable episode. Hey, Dave, how are you today, brother?
I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm great, man. I'm looking forward to our episode. We're sitting here on Memorial Day, and it may release probably about 8 weeks out from today, but you and I are enjoying a beautiful Memorial Day, and we are getting to honor the people who have fallen for our country and our lives. And then on top of it, we live in beautiful Florida, right? You're right in Pensacola with me, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, I know you're from all around the world, and I get referred to Dr. Dave by one of our other remarkable guests, Gene Valentino. And it just happens he's also in Pensacola, Florida. We've never met. So this is actually a great opportunity where Dave and I are getting to be friends. You and Dave get to be friends, and we all get to learn and grow together. So the wonderful thing about our episodes is this is Dave's story. This is how God led his life, but these are evergreen episodes. So if you go back to episode 1 of the podcast all the way through today and any episodes we have in the future, you just pick either the topic or the guest or however God leads you. They're not time specific. So it doesn't matter if it's Memorial Day, Christmas, Easter, Canadian Boxing Day. It's all a good day, right? But Dave, at this time, brother, what's your story, man? Tell us about, where were you? Where did you originate? Where did God birth you? What's your story? How did you develop and become the man you are today? So at this time, man, please share.
All right. I was actually born in Philadelphia. I live here in Pensacola now, but I've lived over the United States for a number of years, lots of different places. And but I spent the first 18 years growing up in Upper Darby, which is in Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia. So technically West Philadelphia, born and raised. And
nice.
That's right.
For those of you not in America, that's a Fresh Prince of Bel-Air reference.
Oh yeah, big fan. Grew up in that era too. So, and I grew up in a family. I'm the oldest of 4, and not a very particularly religious family. My dad's side was 100% Ashkenazi Jew, and my mother's side was Catholic. And so, technically, I was raised Catholic. But that never really sat well with me personally. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with Catholicism. I don't want to offend anybody, but it didn't resonate with me very much. And so I never really grew up in a very religious manner. I never really grew up feeling as though God was a part of my life. And in the meantime, one of the more significant stories of my childhood is that my parents were divorced when I was in middle school. And I think that was much harder on my siblings than it was for me. And in fact, I was actually quite happy about it. There was lots of strife in my home growing up. And most people wouldn't recognize this about me now, but I grew up on food stamps, single mother home. My dad was absent. There was drugs, alcohol, crime all around me. And one of the things that I'd love to highlight for your listeners is the way that God navigated that for me, despite the fact that I didn't have a relationship with him at the time. I look back at some of the wise decisions I made as like an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, 13-year-old. And I realized that even that wisdom was not in me necessarily, but I was guided by a spirit of a God that I would come to know. And I look back and I kind of marvel at it. And so I generally struggled a lot in middle school with relationships and just the typical middle school stuff. But then you add on the divorce of my parents and the difficulties that came along with that with my siblings. And it was a very troubling childhood for most people.
And how many siblings did you have?
I had three siblings, and so I was the oldest of four. And I kind of took on a role of the father in the household. My mother would come in and say, "Hey, David, get your brother to do this," because they won't listen or whatever it was. And it's not to say that I was the goody two shoe either. I felt like we all had our struggles without a very strong male leader in my home. And I feel like that shaped my family quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I don't want to be jumping ahead because this may be part of the story, but when you have a father figure gone, that's huge. And, one of Satan's tricks is he wants to break the home, because if he breaks the home, he breaks the church, he breaks the community, he breaks the state, the country, the world. And it starts with us. So
when you say us, are you
personal.
referring to the men?
No, every individual on the planet, it starts inside of us. But then as the man, with us in the home, what people see every day and they take for granted, they get calloused, is when the father figure is gone, us as men, in that case, it's super impacting to the children and families. And if you look at federal prisons, it's like 90+% grew up without a father in the home. So it really guides our moral compass and our confidence. So one of the questions I have, and I don't want to jump ahead if this is part of your story, but how did you heal from the abandonment of your father? Is that something you're still dealing with? Is that something you feel like you've overcome? Because a lot of us grew up without a dad or a father in the home. So how did you deal with that?
That's a really, really good question. I don't, if I had to really put my thumb on it, is I grew up not expecting too much from my father. And so when he left, in fact, if anything, I may have saw him more after the divorce, because now there's like a scheduled time, where he's around, as opposed to him. Now, my father is a good man from the world's perspective. He was a very loving person. I think that I don't want to dishonor him or my mother, for that matter, in our conversation. I will say this: my father wasn't a very wise person, and he wasn't someone I always looked up to, and that was from a very early age. So when my father left, there wasn't much of a wound that I felt like I needed to heal from. If anything, there was a bit of a callousness. And maybe that's what I've had to deal with, is softening that callous in relationships, more so than trying to heal from brokenness from the abandonment.
So do you feel like you've accomplished that at this point where you have healing, or are you still struggling with it?
I would say there's still a process that needs to happen for me. My wife and I were married in 2012, and so we're kind of 9 years out right now. We're going to be celebrating, and
congratulations.
Thank you.
And since you're in Pensacola, Global Grill, great place to celebrate.
Very good. I'll keep that up in my mind.
Oh man, best filet mignon in town. You can cut it with the back of your knife.
That's awesome.
Go ahead.
So you knew where I was a steak guy, so we're good.
Yeah, man, we have a lot of similarities. I figure you must like red meat. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so it's funny. God saw fit to pair me with somebody, and my wife, who's a very empathetic person, a very, not like, don't take this the wrong way, not an emotional wreck, but someone who feels a lot, and meanwhile, I'm callous to most of that. I'm very, level, if I'm real happy, I'm here. If I'm real sad, I'm here. Most people are probably like this, though. You won't, I do wear my emotions on my sleeve. You'll know what I'm thinking and feeling, but the highs are not all that high. The lows aren't too low. But I think that that's gotten better with just the mere fact of being married to my wife. I think that's how that healing is coming through. I've definitely softened the calluses quite a bit. And then we have 4 kids right now. And so I think in the same process is going through with them. I'm learning to interact with them in a way that is, at the very least, noticing their emotions and knowing that they don't know how to deal with them. And it's my job to actually teach them. Meanwhile, I've never really had to deal with very strong emotions in either way. And that's been a learning experience. It's one thing to reflect inside. It's another thing for your reflection to be pushing and looking at you straight in the face through your daughter's eyes or your wife's eyes. And I think that has actually been more impactful to me than anything else.
Yeah, it kind of forces you to express what you're thinking and kind of search what you're thinking. So go back to the ways that you have healed towards your father, like you said, the callousness. What are some practical ways the listeners? Because like I grew up in a home without my dad. He told my mom, get an abortion. They weren't married. Then once she didn't get an abortion, he just wasn't around. Okay. Now he's like you. He's actually a great guy. It's just him and my mom didn't get along. And his solution was, boom, we're just not going to deal with anything as that part of life. We're moving on. So I didn't even talk to him until my 20s. But what were the things that you've done or are doing to kind of take off those layers of callous and have a heart towards him, a loving heart?
Well, there is still a lot of distance between me and my family. I feel like I've reached out on a number of occasions. And so the healing that has taken place, I think, on my side. I think in a lot of ways, as you learn about my story, you'll understand it more. I'm a little intimidating to my family. I've got a very strong personality. I'm an alpha. I'm a type A. I'm a go-getter. And that's kind of how God designed me. And I think that personality is intimidating to those that I grew up with in my family, and even with my father. I know back when I was younger, God did a wonderful thing, and what He did was He knew that I needed a father figure. He knew I needed mentors. I was always the kid that I was very annoying. I did not have social graces. I had rough edges, big time rough edges, but the heart was always there to do what was right. And I think eventually God knew that. And so He did bring, in ninth grade, I got involved in Young Life, and it's not as big around down here in the South, but Young Life is a high school ministry where they had some camps around the country we go to. And I got involved in that ministry through some friends on my track team. And through that ministry, I came to know Christ at the end of my ninth grade year. And it's interesting. I went to a Young Life camp for a week. I got home for a week, and then I went to Disney World. Now, this is from Pennsylvania, so it's a big deal. And we traveled down there. I went down there. My family even allowed my girlfriend to come with us. And so I had a week in Disney World with my girlfriend in high school. And I still say to this day that Young Life week was so much better, so much more fun than Disney World. And I think the reason why is I was touched. God touched me that week. And I wouldn't say I became a Christian that week. I'll test the waters. I'm not going to jump right in. I'm very, I'll keep a distance for a little while I kind of chew the cud, as it were. And I would say over the course of 2 years, I became a Christian. And I never had that one moment where I was like, that's when I became a Christian. I didn't have that moment where I prayed the prayer. But I do know, like, by the time I was a junior, I was living as a Christian and bothered by things that I was bothered by my sin. And I worked through the scriptures to learn more about who God was and whatnot over those couple years. And during that time, when I got involved in Young Life, I was introduced to a young couple at the time, and their name was Stephanie and Dave. And God used them in profound ways to mentor me. And a lot of the mentorship actually came from working under Stephanie. She had like a house flipping business, and I did odd jobs for her. And we'd be sitting there painting the ceiling or painting the walls, and she'd be like, "So tell me about Jesus. What do you think about him?" And just she'd grill me, and in a good way, very loving way. And there were times where she's like, "Oh yeah, you'll have to dump that girlfriend, and you'll have to do this, and you'll have to do that one day." And I'm like, and I'd fight her with, I'm like, "No way, Steph, you don't know what you're talking about." And but she was what God, she was what God used in a lot of ways. Her husband, David, has served as a strong male role model for me most of my life. I'm still friends with them today. They are the official godparents of my daughter, who I always call Steph and Dave my godparents. They weren't official, but that's who God put in as a part of my family. So at the same time that my family was broken apart, within a year, God restored a new Christ family for me, and through Stephanie and Dave and a couple of friends from high school that were also believers. And it radically shaped my high school life. So number one, God replaced father figures for me. And that's something that, on one hand, God just lays in your lap. But at the same time, if I'm going to encourage others that are dealing with brokenness from an empty a fatherless home, the one thing I would say is you do need to search it out a bit. I wasn't once Stephanie brought me into her circle, I sought out time with Dave. I was like, "Hey, I want to spend time with Dave." And I would ask him questions too, like, "Hey, what's it look like to be a man this way or that way?" Because I didn't know. I always told people growing up that I always knew what not to do. I just didn't know necessarily what I should do or how to do it. And so I needed that guidance and I needed that mentorship. And I don't think anyone would ever be, if anything, people are going to be honored by you searching them out, saying, "You're an honorable man that I see walks with Christ. Can you meet with me on a regular basis to just mentor me a little bit?" That might be one of the biggest honors someone ever receives. If someone ever asked me to do that, I would be honored. And I know, David, I bet you would feel the same way. The reality is that we seem to think that we're going to be inconveniencing others. But if someone is truly an honorable person that is worth listening to, they're going to want to pour out to you because they're going to have the mind of Peter or the mind of Paul to pour out to Timothy or someone like yourself. Like that's the whole point of discipleship. And so Stephanie and Dave definitely discipled me, not only in scripture and what kind of relationship we can have with God, but in life. And that was where I needed a lot of work. I was I was in a bad way in terms of my social graces and how to treat others and what it looked like to love. I didn't have a concept or anything to compare it to. And I think having those mentors in my life really helped. When I went to college, God did the same thing. And I had some extra distance between Dave and Steph, but I received a new mentor in college and another mentor in grad school. And even now, it's funny how it kind of circles back because now Dave and Steph are a bigger part of my life again as I'm an adult, an older adult than I was in college. And I've always had someone to look up to and ask questions of. And I think that is a huge, huge part of how God has been able to restore a lot of the things that I'd lacked because I didn't have a father.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, mentorship, discipleship, big brother, big sister programs, all of these terms and all of these, organizations that put young men with older men who are strong and have character, it's to fill the absence of what we should have in the home naturally with the father. And what Dave's explaining is he, along his journey, even though the father was removed, earthly father, the heavenly father was always there. And at each phase, God brought you a mentor, a man to fill that gap. Was there something you did to look for this man, or did God just intervene?
I think a little bit of both. You can take a horse to the trough, but you can't make him drink. And I think there's a couple other statements like that I can make. God put people in my path, and I took that opportunity. And I think it's really important for me to give God that glory, but it's also equally important for me to recognize that if I chose not to do it, or not to say something, or not to ask that question, I wouldn't have had that. That's the thing about mentorship. Everyone should have a mentor. If you want to, if we're going to talk about being successful in life, and define success, let me just be very clear. There's lots of ways to define success. As a Christian, number one success, obedience. If I'm obedient today, I was successful. And of course, that's going to be to God. If I'm obedient to God, that's a successful day. That's a successful month. That's a successful year. Now, that obedience is going to percolate all kinds of good blessings too. God, he says that, test me in this. And if you give to my storehouses, I'm gonna make your storehouse overflow. That's one of the only times God actually asks us to test him. It is in the tithe offering, for example. But at the same time, but then the Bible is very specific about saying all the money in the world is not as good as wisdom, And so when it comes down to what is successful in my mind, is to be obedient to the word, be obedient to God's commands, be obedient. Now, am I perfect? No, I sin all day. I do it all the time, but I'm also repentant, and then I move on. I don't live in shame. And that's something maybe we can touch on, because I think a lot of people get all hung up on trying to be obedient, and then they fail, and then they have that burden of shame. I would say it's the enemy putting that burden of shame on you, because he's the accuser of the brethren. And we, as Christians, we're made clean through that blood of Christ. And so we get the best of both worlds. Unfortunately, in the earth here, the worldly way of going about it is when you do good, you should feel happy. When you do bad, you should feel bad. The way the Christian world should look is when we do well and we are successful in our obedience, we get blessing. We get blessing from like the riches in heaven. We get the blessing of the natural outcome of God's direction, and then we get the actual extra blessing. Oh, he obeyed, I'm going to give him a good thing, and it could be lots. We can easily go to the material, but that's where our minds go. But I would say there's just as much spiritual blessing in that, wisdom blessing in that, than it is material. That's inconsequential in my mind. I'm not, although material blessing is good and comfortable, that should probably, in my mind, it should be lower on the totem pole of the desire of the treasures in heaven that we store up in our obedience, and the ability to store up the blessing that God has for us in other avenues. So I say all to say, if you're going through being successful throughout life, the first thing that has to happen is you need to be obedient. And I say all that to say, well, how do you become obedient to God? Well, someone has to teach you. And I think that that's the whole point of discipleship. Jesus didn't show up on the scene and say, okay, Peter, this is how you do it, and then now go do it. He walked with them for years and demonstrated it. And I think that, whether you want to call a mentor is somebody who disciples you, is really what we should be, the terms that we should be thinking about. And I think it's important that if it wasn't for God putting in place for me people to disciple me, I would not be successful in all the avenues. And obviously, first and foremost, the ability to honor him with my obedience on a hopefully more regular basis as the days go on.
Yeah, and you've given a lot of wisdom, Dave, and a lot you've just unpacked. So if you're listening, go back and maybe listen again to what Dave just said, because I'm just going to go through some of the points that I think we should at least hit on to make sure we picked up on. But you mentioned prosperity and blessing, and you talked about how, doing the right thing and obedience, God will bless. He will 100%. It may not be on our timetable, though. So keep that, not talking to you, listen to the audience. Dave and I don't want us to take anything for granted. God always is true. God always is real. And most of the time we're going to see, we reap what we sow in this life, but there's always eternity. And like our slogan says, don't just listen, but do and repeat for life, so you can have a great life in this world and in eternity. But there's people in the Bible who went 30 years before they saw the prosperity, but it came. And then there's people who are going to see it. You look at people who went through the Holocaust, man, they died. But if they were faithful to God to the end, they're having an eternity of blessing. So I just don't want you to be like, because I've got down on it, Dave, I'm sure you have too. You're like, man, I'm doing the right thing, but why are bad things happening, right? And
it's interesting you mentioned that. I don't know where people are spiritually. I'm just going to speak where I come from in my walk. But when I find that I'm doing the right things and I'm honoring God with my actions and obeying, that's when I'm the most dangerous to Satan.
Yeah, and that's when he's going to attack you.
He's going to attack you, and that's the thing. Listen, I very much believe in spiritual warfare. If you don't, as a Christian, I think you are ignoring a large part of a battle that's been raging for since the beginning of time. And right from the get-go, Satan's just tempting. And he's like I said earlier, he is the accuser of the brethren. When you have shame and you're self-doubt, when you're producing fruit that is not good, you're believing lies in one way or another. And when you are having outcomes in life, like, listen, the last 2 years of my life have been probably the hardest 2 years of my life, yet I've also been the most faithful to God in the last 2 years of my life. And I think that, on one hand, God's not going to give you or ask of you more than you can handle. But at the same time, when you are doing the Job thing and you're killing it, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you're faithful to God, Satan's going to be like, you're up on the radar now, Satan. Satan's not going to attack you if you're lukewarm. And I think the faithful in Christianity around the world, we need to be sensitive to that. We need to recognize that when we are doing ministry, when we're loving on others, these last few weeks, there's these two couples that my wife and I have been ministering to, like, insane attack, like random stuff. I'm a physical therapist. We can get to that at some point. My wife's back, she couldn't even stand up straight, and I'm like, what the heck? And I'm looking at her like, how are we going to handle this? Because we're supposed to be going out with this couple. It's insane stuff like that. When it happens, it's all part of that spiritual warfare that we're a part of.
Yeah, and I agree completely. And our frame of reference, just so you know, Dave, we have listeners from over 81 countries. The nucleus is probably conservative Christians, but we have people who are all sorts of nationalities, all sorts of worldviews, and where our community kind of has that commonality is that we're all looking to grow. So Dave and I both believe in God of the Bible. We believe in not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament. And what Dave's talking about is when Satan fell from heaven, he brought a third of the angels with him. And fallen angel is a demon. So the only difference between an angel and a demon is the choice. Did they choose to follow God or Satan? And Satan only has two objectives. One, to keep people from trusting Christ and knowing the truth. And two, like Dave said, okay, they trusted Christ maybe with their life, but he's going to ruin their life and ruin their testimony and break them down. He's going to sift them like wheat so nobody listens to them about God. And so they're completely useless as far as the kingdom's concerned. So that's what Dave and I are referring to if you're on a different frame of reference. But Dave, I do want you to, on that note, go back to you said when you were at Young Life, that's where you came to know Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also said, the moment of salvation maybe was down the road. Explain what you meant by coming to know Christ, because to us, that's a common term. But to our listeners in Ghana or our listeners in India or even England, they might not know what the heck you're talking about. So talk about coming to know Christ and what that means.
Yeah. So, I'll start with a story. The way that the camp at Young Life did it is they spent like 4 or 5 days in the evenings giving us a talk, saying, hey, you're sinful. What are you going to do about it? And they hashed that out quite a bit. And then the second to last night, they said, listen, and they've been building up to this. So it didn't just come out of nowhere. And we were softened to the idea. And they said, listen, you're sinful. Raise your hand if you're perfect. And no one raised their hand. Or, okay, we get it. So what can you do about it? And we're all like, well, we can just do better. And, we can, sort of like a balancing of the scales was a very common thing that we all kind of agreed on. And the person giving the talk said, that's hogwash. That's terrible. It's a terrible idea, because now you got to sit there and keep track. And we're all like, oh yeah, that's true. And he's like, let me propose this to you. You can't do a darn thing about it. Period. You're screwed. And he left it at that. And I was really upset. You want to see Dave heated? That was Dave heated at the time, and I was mad because I'm like, who are you to say I can't do something about this? And at this point, this is, I was 13 or so, and at the time I've not heard the gospel. I grew up, and this is why the Catholic community that I grew up in, and I'm sure this is not true around the world necessarily, but the Catholic group that I grew up in didn't adequately explain to me the gospel, because I was genuinely hurt and offended that these people are telling me that I couldn't do anything about my salvation or anything about my sin. And the last night was, they presented the gospel saying, well, good. I'm glad that you're unable to do anything because God already did for you. Let me show you how. And then they present the gospel, which is, you're a sinner. Christ knew it, came down, lived as a man and God. He lived the perfect life as a replacement and atonement for your sin. And in a very mirrored image, a very all the Old Testament is foreshadowing Christ. Any listeners that are Jewish, listen, half my family is Jewish, and I had the honor to bring my 100% Ashkenazi Jew grandmother to Christ years ago, and she's been going to a Messianic synagogue, until the day that she passed. And if anyone doesn't understand that Old Testament is just a foreshadowing of Christ through and through, I really encourage you to read it. It's just littered with it. And so, the gospel is saying, okay, we're going to take that atonement that we've been using as just, I guess in Hebrews, the writer explains how the sacrificial practices were just I think the word is it held off the wrath of God. It just postponed it. It put it off. It was never something as a complete, saving practice. Whereas when Jesus came, he was the saving practice. And so he dies for our sin. And now we can live in freedom from the law. Not to say that we don't obey the law in a lot of ways that Christ kind of put. I mean, he said, love yourself, love God, love one another. Like, do these things. and then all the law falls under that. And so there's things that we're supposed to do. However, we don't do it out of a need to earn our salvation, but as a way of honoring him, again, through our obedience, hopefully succeeding in that. So that gospel was explained, and I was still I was like, okay, I get it. Now you're just saying I just need to say yes to Jesus. That makes sense. I've heard that before. And that night, my young life leader, his name was Ryan, and he was like a law student, and I was grilling him with questions. And it may seem silly to someone else, maybe not, but I was asking questions like, well, why wasn't Jesus a girl? Why did he have to go at this time? What about the people in, China that never heard of him? Like all these questions just to get at him is really, not necessarily like with malicious intent, but more of like, well, tell me this, tell me that. All these stupid questions.
And some of them were legit, and some of them were just kind of playing with them. But most of them, you really were like trying to figure out what's real and what's fake. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, I'm not disbelieving anything the Bible says, but what about dinosaurs? What about aliens? What about this? And if someone can answer it to you from the Bible, you're in good company, cover to cover, not manipulating one verse out of context. But if they're just speaking based on, oh, that sounds good, or their opinion, you need to kick that person to the curb, right?
Yeah. And fortunately, the counselor, the leader there, Ryan, he kind of just stopped because he knew where I was going with all this. He goes, Dave, listen, I'm not going to be able to answer all your questions, but God will. Give it some time and dedicate some time to it. And the questions that you have, you'll either have two results. One, he'll answer it for you, or two, you'll come to realize it doesn't matter. And from that point on, I said, okay, I'll give it some time. And, over the course of the next year, I went to Bible study, I learned and I studied and really dug into it. And I think there were a couple specific things that really played a key role. I'm a very analytical, logical person. You are not going to win me over with emotion. And I explained that earlier. I don't fluctuate too much. But what you will win me over with is some logic, some history, some personal accounts. And so I know the Case for Christ was written about that time, maybe a little before. I know probably was a few years prior to this, but that really played a key role in me being convinced that I'm like, okay, Christianity essentially does hinge on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. And it just so happens we have absolutely the most historical evidence possible of that actually happening.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, so at that point, I think at some point I realized these 11 disciples acted as if he rose from the dead for the rest of their lives, which some were short and some were longer, but they all were martyred. And they didn't change. And then Paul, which is, I think, in my opinion, the greatest testimony of all, who was a Pharisee of Pharisees, literally in line to be the high priest. Like, he's there. It's top tier. It's kind of like, not to get too political in America here, but it's kind of like Joe Biden turning around and saying, I'm Republican, and then acting like it. That's what happened with Paul. Paul was like the man, and was going to be like, he's out there actively killing and persecuting Christians. And then the road to Damascus, he changes completely. And he goes completely on fire for God. And I'm like, listen, he had everything to lose. There is no logical reason that man could possibly ever decide, you know what, I'm going to go be a Christian, the same people that have been persecuting for the last decade or the last 5 years, whatever it was, and turn around and become the main author of the New Testament.
Yeah. And if you're, again, not familiar with, there's so much that Dave and I are talking about that you're part of right now. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. And Dave and I are spending a lot of time talking about this, but there's so much more. So if you have any questions about what Dave and I are talking about, there'll be links in the show notes to me, to Dave. Reach out to us. And not only will we try to answer your questions, but we'll try to connect you with somebody in your area who can sit down with you. Because like Dave's talked about so eloquently about, what do you call it, mentoring or discipleship or whatever term you use, that's a biblical model to be discipled and grow, and to be discipling someone who you're helping grow. And there's a balance. Like, you don't, like you were saying, it was beautiful. It took years for Jesus to disciple the apostles, right? They were disciples and they became apostles. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to have 3 Bible studies with you and you're good to go. And sometimes people just jump into, oh, I got to disciple people, but they don't even know what they're doing yet. Now, there's a balance again. I remember the guy who discipled me that God used to change my life, Tony Stefanini. He wasn't a man without fault or flaw. None of us are. But he took the time to come meet with a kid 2, sometimes 3 times a week, answer my questions like Dave had with his friends, Stephanie and also David. We got a lot of Davids here today.
We do.
And they changed his life because it's just a relationship. It's just spending time together. And again, Dave and I are very familiar with religion and Christianity and God. But if you're not and you're hearing all these terms, don't worry about it. Just take it step by step, decently in order. The Bible is the book of writings that we have, thankfully. It's recorded and it's proven, and it's historical truth, not just stories, but historical truth. Like the Smithsonian, I think they've used it like 56 times for explorations, and all 56 times they found exactly what they were looking for based on the Bible. So it's not like these are just written stories like David and Goliath is just it's like a comic book. No, it was real. So when you're looking at the Old Testament, that's before Jesus. New Testament's after. Old Testament, like Dave said, is all of the stories and foundation and the law, and it sets the foundation. But then the New Testament, it talks about the atonement and the freedom we have through Christ and the salvation, and how now the law, we don't have to work tirelessly to try to be without sin, because that's impossible. But through Christ, we have that. And now the New Testament kind of explains where we are today and gives us that freedom where we don't have to serve God, but we want to serve God. So there's just so many things you're talking about, Dave, and like from biblical discipleship and talking about, religion versus relationship. You can go to church every day, but that doesn't mean anything's going to change in your life. The relationship you have personally with God is what Dave's talking about. That's what's special. That's what's life-changing. That's what gives you that peace and joy, even in the darkest hour. And if you're going to a church and you see a bunch of people who are one way for 2 hours on Sunday morning or Wednesday night, and they're a completely different person outside of that building, that's not a real Christian. Christian means to be Christ-like. There's nobody in the Bible that called himself a Christian. I think, was it in Acts? It says they were first called Christians in Antioch. So the people in Antioch saw the disciples and they said, wow, those people act like Christ. So just remember, there's a lot of stuff. You grew up a certain way. I grew up a certain way. Dave grew up a certain way. But when you're hearing all this, always go back to the Bible. Is what you're being told lining up with Scripture? And then when you have those questions like Dave had, he went to his young life counselor and he was asking these questions. And what did the young life counselor? Point them back to the Bible, point them back to God. That's what you need to be looking for so you can grow. So Dave, what we're talking about is the most important thing in the world, but I don't want to distract from your story that ties all this together. So anything you want to say that we've missed to this point, absolutely fill in. Anything you want to continue with this conversation, keep going. But if you're done and you think we've covered that adequately, pick up with your story and keep going with how God led your life and was with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think high school is a really interesting time. So at the time I dated for an American high schooler, dating someone for 2.5 years is a pretty long time. I had that.
Sadly, that's long for marriage these days too, but yeah.
Unfortunately, it can be. And so I was in a pretty serious relationship. with that woman, and she and I unfortunately grew apart, but she didn't change. It was me. And I think that was the big difference, is that if it wasn't for Christ, I probably would have married her right out of high school. And thankfully I didn't. There's a lot of reasons why that would have been very bad. But in high school, I went through a lot of changes. I was a pretty competitive runner. I was again, still trying to be the father figure of my house. I obviously was dating my girlfriend at the time, and still trying to be some kind of a decent student. No one in my family has ever graduated college, and so I was the first. And it was kind of just, I knew that's what I was going to do. I was going to go to college, and I was going to have a career. And the main reason why is I looked around and I saw, the food stamps. I saw my mom, God bless her, she worked 4 part-time jobs to provide for me and my 3 other siblings. So, I mean, she was a single mother of 4. And I'm 10 years older than my youngest sister. So at the time when I was 13 years old, my sister was just 3. I mean, that's a big span. And so I was definitely helping out a lot.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
For someone who doesn't have kids, when you have 1 kid and 2 parents, that keeps you going. When you get to the 2-on-2 ratio, that's challenging. And then when you start getting outnumbered, man, it's almost impossible to be a single mom to do that, or a single dad. It just takes a lot of love and a lot of effort. So your mom, give her props, man.
Yeah. And, there's definitely areas where both of my parents, myself, we all could have done better. Obviously, I think what made me different, though, so if you were to look at my family at the time, I was in high school. I had my brother was in middle school, and then one other brother in grade school, and then my sister, who was kind of just coming into pre-K area. And what was really frustrating is that I lived, up until that point, all my siblings, we all lived the same way. What started to change, though, was that Christ got a hold of me. And if we all were kind of headed down this certain path, all of a sudden I just started veering off to the side, like almost a complete U-turn. And again, I can't necessarily explain to you where I've come from without really explaining a little bit my siblings' stories. All 3 of them have been in jail one time or another. They've all had addiction and drug problems, and they all have broken relationships or children out of wedlock, one way or another. And I want to make this very clear. I don't bring that up saying, look how awesome I am. What I do want to say is this: the result that I've had in my life, which is far more blessed than them, there's only one difference: Jesus. Period. There's you don't get wisdom on your own. You're just not just a smart person. If you ask for it, God will give you in abundance. Ask and you shall receive. And that's Matthew right there. The reality is, when I was younger, I asked for that wisdom. I said, God, give me wisdom. And that's what he did. He gave me wisdom, and he gave me wisdom through mentors. He gave me wisdom through the Bible. And then I got to implement it. I can't, you can't just say, hey, I want these things, and you ask for wisdom. Well, what you do is when you learn wisdom, what you end up doing is delaying pleasure. Like, that's a very strong characteristic of someone who is wise. They actually go ahead and forego short-term quick pleasure for long-term profound pleasure. And that's something that I was able to accomplish, but I only was able to accomplish it because of what Jesus was able to do in my heart. And so when you see the contrast between maybe myself versus the rest of my family, don't look and say, look, Dave did good. and Dave accomplished, and look, Dave is a remarkable person. I'm just a dude who is remarkable because of Jesus. There's a difference.
Oh, huge difference. And I totally get where you're coming from. You're basically not trying to bash your brothers and sisters, but what you're saying is the statistical average for someone who grew up like you did is disaster.
Yes.
And the difference for me and you is we've trusted Jesus at a young age, and he's literally changed our lives, our thinking, our hearts, our desires. And it's not bad. It's good. It's so good. And like you said, short-term loss for long-term gain. Looking back, it's like there was actually no loss. I mean, back then, certain things seemed like a huge sacrifice. And now it's like, oh, thank you, Lord, that you guided me that way, right?
And that's how, and then again, so you understand where my family was at the time, and then you see, oh, well, what's Dave doing in high school? Dave is somehow keeping it together with his academics, and is excelling in my track career, and at the same time not doing the best thing in this relationship with my girlfriend. And we start drifting apart, and eventually I just felt like God was saying, you just need to move on. You got to do that. And that was a pretty rough time. I had a death in the family about the same time that I decided to move on from that relationship. I actually developed mono, or it's a severe fatigue,
CMV?
Mono.
Oh, mono. Okay. I thought you were saying you had CMV, which is the advanced mono. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm like, I had that too.
Yeah. It was just, it was mild enough where it took me out of my track season for a while, which was, when the captain of the track team, and I'm sitting there running slower than the girls team. There's something wrong. And so finally we got my blood tested, and I had mono, and so that took me out a while. So there was a lot of hardship that came in that beginning of my senior year of high school. And but it was, I think the hardship was God's way of getting rid of some things. So, for example, that relationship had to go. Number two, God saw my pride in my track career, and he's like, that's got to go. And there's some these things that God said, listen, I need to purge some of these things out of your life, so that when you go to college, there's a renewed mind, there's a renewed soul there that I'm sending, because you have another chapter. And I think that was key. So high school ended pretty well. I actually, after I graduated high school in the Philadelphia area, I had it with my family. I needed some distance between me and them for a number of reasons. I would pour out, and it was hard to get filled back up at that point. And so I went as far as I could while still staying in state. I went to the University of Pittsburgh. And it just so happened they have a really good physical therapy program for me. And so I started there right out of high school. And what was really cool is that there was another organization similar to Young Life that is called the CCO. In fact, if some of your listeners here in America may have heard of the CCO, recently they were in the news last year. There was some racial scandal going on a little bit. It seems like everyone's getting thrown under the bus one way or another. I'm still very closely associated with the CCO now, and I'll just take this moment to say this. I know personally one of my mentors is one of the regional directors of the CCO, which is the Coalition for Christian Outreach. And I asked him, okay, give me the lowdown, because my wife and I we financially support them, and I need to know like what's going on. And he was brutally honest. He said, some of the stuff that came out, there's some truth to it, and at the same time, there's a ton of stuff that came out that is completely unfounded. And just like the last year and a half, nobody really knows what is true and what is not, which is why it's really important to be listening to what the Holy Spirit says to us. Because unfortunately, you can't believe the news very much.
Yeah,
Anyway,
and like we discussed before, everybody in every organization moving forward to better people's lives for Christ, Satan's has got a big target on their back.
yes. Oh, absolutely. And so, I said all that to say, the CCO I think is an excellent organization. We decided, my wife and I, not to change anything we're doing with them and to weather the storm, because what they do is they minister to young people on college campuses. And if there was a single place in the world that is one of the most hostile places for Christians, it's the American college scene. It really, really is. And it's only been 15 years since I graduated or so. And, it's insane to think how much has changed. But there's a lot of struggles that people are going through on the college campus that need to be supported by the gospel. And
Yeah,
so,
and I agree. And a lot of I taught at a college for 3 years, and luckily I taught at a Christian organization in the sense of like, their religious beliefs and background. But I've gone to secular different universities, and the majority of the problem stems with the administration. They're a bunch of liberal, like horrible humans that have a terrible agenda, never worked a real day in their life, and they're sitting there telling people a bunch of lies and enjoying it. And then the students come out absolutely confused and useless. So people are people, and there's good and bad and all. Good, quote, unquote, bad. But these university teachers are just programming these kids with lies, and then they're coming out more confused than they went in, and that's just the mess.
well, you brought up the lies. It's like, well, who's the father of lies? It's Satan. And if you can control people from a young age, that's how you're going to change America's culture, the way we were founded, and the whole bit. But I will say this: you mentioned these horrible people, and I think I know you well enough to know that I'm going to clarify something for you that I think you're going to agree with. And and then sometimes I personally need to be reminded of this, that we don't war against flesh and blood. Right? These people have been deceived by the great deceiver, by the father of lies. They are not our enemies. The liberals or the people that that we have to fight against for truth, to fight against saying, hey, look, this is capital T truth. They are just mere pawns in this spiritual battle that's been raging forever. And so it's hard though, because they're coming after Christians in a lot of ways too. And so it's easy to get your fists ready to go and saying, all right, fine. If you want to fight, let's bring it, because I've got facts and I've got logic. I've got the gospel. I can do all these things. Meanwhile, what we should be looking at these people is and say, listen, they've just been deceived and we need to win them over, which is what Paul did. And it's harder. That's harder to do in a lot of ways.
And I agree 100% with what you're saying. We need to have love. And Jesus was the perfect model. Anytime somebody attacked Jesus, he took it. Anytime somebody attacked God, he didn't take it. He put his foot down. So it's like, that's what we need to model our lives after. Like if someone is speaking foolishness, you just take it. But when somebody speaks against God, everybody talks about when Jesus threw the money table, changing tables over in the temple, but also who did he wrath on more than anybody? There was people that we today would call believers and unbelievers. He didn't really have an issue with either one of those. He came for the unbelievers. He knows the believers are solid. He's there to help them grow. But who did Jesus wrath on? The hypocrites, the scribes, the Pharisees, the people who pretended to be good and they were bad. Those are the people that blew his top, so to speak, but he never lost it, never sinned. It was always in a godly way. But that needs to be our model, righteousness, love, but also direct truth. You don't have to be a snowflake.
Well, and I think you made a good point there, who did he go after? And you said, what did he do? He kind of didn't necessarily go after people, and he didn't necessarily blow up when people went after him versus the father. But I thought you were going somewhere else with this. Here's the one thing that is true too, though, is that he never was concerned about how he made people feel. And I think that that's something that's really important. When truth meets a lie, there's going to be hurt. And so doesn't mean we can't speak truth in love and actually come alongside people, disciple them and mentor them or help them and be compassionate for terrible situations. But there's a difference between that and then either perpetuating lies or partnering with them or agreeing with lies. Because I think in the spiritual world, I think we get into a lot of trouble when we're doing that. And so, if I'm trying to address some of the problems in our country, a lot of that has to do with how do we gently and sometimes forcefully, but as gentle and as kind as possible, say, hey, look, this is wrong, and at the same time, not be so concerned about how someone's feelings may be hurt, because there's undoubtedly going to be offense when someone's lie is exposed to the light.
Yeah, I agree completely. But the people, just because two people don't agree, either, like, I'm going to use me and you. If we don't agree on something, Dave, either either I'm right and you're wrong, you're right and I'm wrong, or we're both wrong and we need to figure out what's truth, right? So right. It should be a journey as iron sharpeneth iron. So the man, the countenance of a friend. But people today, if you don't agree with them, they cancel you, they complain, they like, you hurt my feelings, you offended me. Come on, man, cut that out. Stop being so weak. Stop being such a little whiner and be real. You're not going to grow. Like people say, never talk about politics or religion. Those are the two most important things.
I know.
Our world is the way it is because you don't talk about it, dummy.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. Is people like, keep your religion out of my politics. I'm like, the reason why I have my politics the way they are is because of my faith.
And so did our founding fathers, despite what they want to change in the history books. Listen, so we could go on. So let's keep going with your story because I love it. Yeah. I know we're trending the same. And if you don't agree with me or Dave, write us. And then we'll try to tell you the truth, or you can tell us the truth, or we can both find the truth. But man, I think history and reality and common sense will prove every time the Bible. And the Bible is always there to prove truth and common sense. So there's never a flaw between the two.
Yeah. So in college, I had the opportunity to be a part of that CCO ministry at the University of Pittsburgh. It's still thriving now. Very, very thankful of it. Essentially, they would have Wednesday night meetings and Bible study another night. So I was really, by that point, ingrained in the church. I was living it out. Still had my struggles, but at the same time, like really growing. And I was on the track to become a physical therapist at the time. I kind of knew where I was going to go before I graduated. I knew what I was wanting to do. And during this time, so talking about, and this is, let's pick up the conversation about the fatherlessness that I had to deal with when I was younger. One of the things that I came to realize is when I was about 20, I was like, man, I really don't know what it's like to be a Christian man. What does it look like to be a man of God? And there was an author that I read called Miles Monroe. In fact, I think he passed away recently in the last few years. And he wrote a book called The Power and Purpose of Men, and then The Power and Purpose of Women. In fact, I read that one too. And what was really important to me was learning what it looks like to be a man, because I didn't have that modeled for me. And so, if you're asking, well, Dave, what else did you do? Well, I found mentors. Well, what else did I do? I read. I'm not much of a reader, to be honest. In fact, the only time you're going to hear me reading about something is when I really feel like I need to know something. I don't really read for pleasure too much, but if I feel as though that there's an information gap between where I think I need to be and where I'm at. I'm going to fill that gap with a book or something. And maybe if I can, I'll get it from a documentary if I need to.
Yeah, audiobooks,
yeah,
documentaries, podcasts. It's a great way to consume media, information.
It is. Oh, absolutely. And so what I did is I read that book, and there was also another book I think it was the Felhan who wrote it. I think it was like Sherry. I might be misquoting it, but it was a book about the statistical differences between the male and female brain, and it was fascinating. Sort of like kind of how men's brains work and how women's brains work, because again, I saw a gap in my understanding for what it looks like to have a healthy relationship. Again, I did not ever have that modeled for me. And then although my godparents were there, again, it was sometimes rare. It was mostly rare for me to see them both at the same time. And, day-to-day relationship was a lot different than, I go over your house every weekend. It's different. And so I took the opportunity to really study these things. And I did this all at the same time where I studied abroad. And this is maybe where some of our international listeners will get a kick out of it. I got the chance to do a semester at sea study abroad program where we sailed around the world on a cruise ship. And the cruise ship was adapted to be a college campus. And I stopped in mostly third world countries. And, 10 different countries, and got to experience culture, religion, food, economics, politics. It was really, really, really cool. And the main thrust of the time abroad for me was assessing my culture, assessing others' cultures, and enjoying those cultures at the same time, allowing, a non-Christian culture to butt up against my Christian worldview and saying, what's the problem? Where do these line up, where these don't line up? In fact, before it was popular, I took a class called The Psychology of Gender on that ship. And we studied gender roles and religious roles throughout these different countries. I also took a class on some of the contemporary history of some of the countries. I say all that to say when I was about 21 was when God said to me, Dave, you need to be learning what it looks like to be a man of God in the Christian worldview. And I want you to compare that to the rest of the world. And that's what I had the opportunity of doing. Now, I can look back and say, that's what's happened. In the time that I was living this, all of this stuff wasn't necessarily like as purposeful as what it sounds like. But I look back, I'm like, that's what God was doing. And it was really good too, because at the time when I was learning all of these things, it was really eye-opening for me. It was really eye-opening to understand some of the things that Satan was going to start attacking. I mean, this is 2005, so we're 2021 now. So we're talking 16 years ago. 16 years ago, the whole gender thing was not a thing. As much of it wasn't very large. How people identify and pronouns and just how gender fluid people are, especially on college campuses. Just homosexuality and gender in general wasn't that large of a problem. In fact, I had a very, very close friend in ministry with me that came out as gay, and I was like, I don't care, you're a friend of mine, let's just hang out. And he didn't want anything of it. Like, he just was like, I'm done with the whole Christian thing. And all of my Christian friends, that was hard for me at the time. So all of these things are coming out. I know that, I wasn't very political at the time either. In fact, going up until 2008, I was from the Northeast. I leaned liberal, but at the same time, I don't think I'd ever really thought about it. But as I grew in my faith is going to impact my worldview, and my worldview absolutely is going to impact my political stance on things. So I think it was really important for me to go through that learning and growing process. I think those 2 years were the years I read the most books. And it resulted in me starting a men's ministry at my church. And I'm thinking to myself, why does my church not have a men's ministry? And you know, I think I've heard of some, you know, men's ministries in the past, and it's always, you know, let's go out and shoot some guns and let's grill some meat, which is all good stuff. I'll do that too. But where my heart was is like, so what does it look like to be a man? Because God, he prepared me for that. I could have easily gone into college, found the wrong people, never really got mentored, never really learned about these things, and fell into a trap of believing lies about gender and male roles. I mean, toxic masculinity is a bunch of crap. I'm sorry. God made man and woman, male and female. He created them, and there are two
equal but different.
Yeah, I mean, of course.
My heart and my liver are equal but different. I need them both or I will die. Men and women are equal but different. And if you don't get that, again, write us, because we really want to help you understand that. And like kindergarten cop, I'm going to be blunt. Boys have penis, girls have vagina. That is how you're born. That's your gender. If you have other feelings and thoughts, we'll work through them. But if a guy goes in the bathroom and my little daughter's in there, I'm not going to let him, because if he's got one issue, he could have more. And that's the truth. There's psychological issues that go along with all of these conditions. And if you're listening now and you're a cross-dresser, God loves you. I love you. I have no problem with that. But for the people who are screaming and making issues out of it, and they're really just trying to cause trouble, and they're rapists pretending so they can hurt other people, those are the people I have a problem with. And those are the people I have a piñata theory. And we'll talk about that in another episode.
Yeah, you know, it's hard. It's hard because there's a whole group of people that would say, oh, that was a very hateful thing that you just said. And, you know, the reality is that you're interpreting your offense with hatred.
Explain that.
Well, if you say something that's offensive, let's say boys and girls are different, and you're offended. Let's say the receiver of that message is offended. And, you know, I think that what's going on is that they're confusing their offense, which is what they have, for your hatred for the topic of which you're talking about. That's not okay. That's a completely irrational train of thought. And I think that people need to recognize that just because we disagree with somebody, and whatever that might be, doesn't mean I now all of a sudden hate the topic or hate the people or whatever. You know, I think it's very cliche, you know, hate the sin, love the sinner. And it's very, I think it's a little outdated. But the reality is, what we should really recognize is that we do need to call out sin for what it is. We need to call out what God has designed for this world and say this is good and true and healthy. And at the same time, have compassion on people who struggle with things. Because the person who is gay, you know, struggles with a sin that's no worse than my propensity to be prideful. It really isn't. In fact, yeah, and I think people don't say that enough. And so the question, but here's the thing though, there's a difference between living your life as a gay person saying, I'm good with this and I'm going to act out my desires according to where I stand, versus me in my house saying, man, that was prideful. I repent, Father, for my sin. Help me be humble and give me wisdom to understand it. There's a submission there to God, as opposed to rising above and putting yourself above others and above God. And I think that's the big problem, is that people who live in their sin recognize it, like this is what I want to do and this is what God says, I think that's the problem. It's not necessarily the mode of sinfulness. There's a lot of those. The question is, what's your response to your sin? Is it humility under God and saying, thank you, Father, for your mercy? Or is it, screw you, God, I'm going to do my thing, and I don't really believe in you, and rejecting his love and truth that he wants to give you?
Yeah. And I think biblically that's sound. There's only, the way I read the Bible cover to cover, there's 3 general categories of sin. There's blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, which means you reject Christ, you reject salvation, you reject the truth. Then you have sins with the body and you have sins without the body. Those are the only 3 categories I see that all their sins fall in. And the thing is, sin is sin. If I had a perfectly white outfit on and I needed to be perfectly clean for me to enter a building, if I have 1 stain or 1,000 stains, I'm not perfect anymore. I can't get in that building. And Jesus, whoa, sorry, I hit my mic if you're not watching. Jesus washes us clean, and then it's always perfect. But yeah, what you're saying, Dave, is just spot on. I'm thankful for you. So keep going with your story, though. Let's keep continuing in your story. I know you got to a point where you're on God TV. You can talk about that and just everything God's doing in your life.
So, college was a great learning experience for me. Lots of growth at that time. And then I graduated into grad school, went to Pitt for 3 years, got my doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh, and started my career as a physical therapist. I can't stress enough how much hard work that was. It kind of frustrates me a little bit when, people talk about privilege, because if you've heard the story so far, I was not privileged. I had, pretty much everything against me. Low socioeconomic status, no father. I had drugs, alcohol, crime all around me. Okay. And at the same time, really had no one to kind of lift me up or prop me up or send me in the right direction, apart from God, throughout this whole problem. If there was ever a privilege that I could acclaim, it's the privilege of being a follower of Jesus Christ. There is privilege in that. There is, I'm going to name drop Dr. Jim Harris. He wrote a book called Our Unfair Advantage. And it's an excellent book, and it's mostly for business people. And so when we get to that, we will, about how I started my practice. But the reality is that we have, as believers, we have this unfair advantage to tap into the Holy Spirit and ask him, what do you have for me? What do you want me to be doing? And the reality is that, God's word does not come back void. So when he speaks, things grow, things are created. And the reality is that, we do have that privilege as being believers. There is a privilege and there is a unfair advantage that we have in this world that everyone else who is an unbeliever does not have. Aside from that, I think instead of talking about color privilege or gender privilege, I think probably the largest privilege that you can have is a father privilege. It's not even necessarily money, it's the father. In fact, there's a statistic that if you just do 3 things in this world, you will live in the middle class. And the first one is graduate high school. Number 2 is don't have children out of wedlock, which speaks to the fatherlessness. And then the last one is get a job. If you do those 3 things, you will be in the middle class in America. It's a very low standard. And so if we're talking about, success from a worldly perspective, it's a very simple thing to obtain. That doesn't mean you won't work hard. And that's kind of where I want to come from. That's why I brought this whole topic up, is that, grad school is very difficult. I lived in my room for 2 years while I studied my butt off to get where I was at. And although I do believe that God kind of got me into grad school, and, I wasn't always the best student, pretty average. What was remarkable is the fact that, hard work still gets you places. And, all you have to do is be respectful to those around you. All you have to do is work hard towards reasonable goals. And if they're big goals, then you can just break them down. And that's what I did in grad school. I graduated, and then from there, and this is another thing I've had to overcome, is that I graduated with $205,000 of debt. So that is something that, again, I didn't have the privilege of my parents helping me with that. And listen, if you did, amen, go for it, whether it's like, getting a scholarship or anything, like, that's awesome. I don't compare myself to people in that regard. But I did spend the next 9 years of my life eating ramen and mac and cheese so that I can pay it off.
Yeah, and that's not an easy life, and people don't understand that. They think in America, business owners rich, and they made a lot of sacrifice most of the time to be there. And if they do have financial wealth, they've paid their dues to get there. And like you have a doctorate. Now you're a doctor of physical therapy. That doesn't mean you haven't made. You still got to work and pay off all that education and still live a life,
Well, that's the thing is, after I graduated, I decided to do what we call travel PT. A lot of people are familiar with travel nursing. We did a lot of that this last year. A lot of nurses traveled up to New York and some of the larger cities around the country for the COVID pandemic. And listen, I was able to get tax breaks and take home a little bit more money and see the country at the same time. I'm already a big traveler. I love seeing new stuff. And so I did some travel work to help pay down that debt. But it's not just about using a big shovel. You also need to make sure that you're not pouring more dirt into your hole or dirt onto your pile, right? And so, yeah, I lived very modest means for a very, very long time. In fact, not only did I pay off $205,000 in 9 years, during those 9 years, I got married, moved across the country twice, and had 4 children. And again, like, I remember living off of like the same budget for, like, with my wife and I, as I personally lived on in college, in grad school. And I think people need to recognize that, yeah, like a majority of millionaires are not millionaires because they inherited anything. I think it's like 80% of millionaires just saved, spent less than they took in.
Yeah, and you know what the average car owned by a millionaire is in America?
Oh, it's probably real low. It's
a Toyota Camry, and then it fluctuates between a Toyota Camry and a Honda Accord.
Yeah,
and that's just it. I mean, people have misconceptions based on Hollywood and the news, and those are the biggest lies. I mean, you might as well read comic books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my wife and I were big Dave Ramsey fans. We didn't do the whole program. I still use my credit card, and we didn't always do the envelopes, but I thought the way that he went through the I think it's the zero sum budgeting is really important. Every dollar having a name.
Yep,
is really important.
Ken Coleman, it's one of Dave Ramsey's. He does the summits.
Personalities,
yeah. He was on our podcast. He's a great guy, and he's just straight down, just like we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to realize that, like, as much as the world says, like, hey, you need others to do for you, or having that I think the victim mentality is one of the greatest lies of our time. Is woe is me, others are at fault, and I'm a victim, and I need you to help me in some way. Listen, I could have smoked pot as a young kid. I could have done drugs and been a part of gangs. I could have been a part of all kinds of crazy bad things. And I didn't, thankfully. Again, I attribute that to more of God being merciful than necessarily me being all that great. That said, when it comes down to it, our choices matter. They matter a lot. and you can either choose wisdom or you can choose foolishness. I mean, those are the two. You read through the Psalms, the Ecclesiastes, you read through the Proverbs, you'll know, hey, there's a foolish way and there's a wise way. I mean, and I think that Americans need to understand that, when it comes down to it, we are living in a time of foolishness. There are fools out there attributing their faults to others and feeling righteous about it and prideful about it. And that's a very dangerous thing. I mean, Jesus said, take the plank out of your own eye before you inspect the dust in someone else's. I mean, that's the reality that we live in, is that the world, ironically, is literally doing the same thing Jesus said not to do to Christians, obviously, and well, he said it to the Pharisees, and then here we are is a overall a-religious leftist movement that is literally doing the same thing the Pharisees did. I mean, almost verbatim. I mean, it's really ridiculous. And we have to somehow tell people, hey, listen, look inward first. And why do you think people hate Jordan Peterson so much? If you guys haven't known, you look him up. He's blown up these last 5 years, 6 years. But I mean, his big thing is clean your room. Why is that? Because he's saying, look inside first before you tell others how to do stuff. And I think that's a big, big thing that no one's really, I think that's why he's attacked so much, is he's literally speaking to troubled young men. And what he's telling them to do is clean your room. Which is a metaphor for get yourself in order.
And it's you start with the foundation and then you build everything upon it. And what doesn't process in my brain is this: even if I wasn't a Christian, I look at everything through a filter of right from wrong, black and white, truth versus lie. And there is absolute truth. And like you said, Satan's the accuser, Satan's a liar. He's the great deceiver. He's trying to take away where people are like, oh, there is no absolute truth. There is absolute truth. If you jump off a building, gravity at 9.82 meters per second squared will take you to the bottom very, very fast. But when it comes to like Jordan Peterson and anybody speaking truth, that black and white, that kind of approach is what we need. And we need to have right from wrong. We need to have black and white. We need to have something we can grasp onto so we can build a firm foundation. Like the Bible talks about building upon rock, not upon sand. And today there's just so many people who spout out craziness. I'm thinking, okay, evolution. The whole concept is something comes from nothing. I mean, everything comes from something, but that means something came from nothing? That's impossible. So if you don't believe in God, that's fine, but don't believe that a cosmic fart started our life, right? Like this pen couldn't create itself. If I took my shoelace out of my shoe, put both in a box and shook it, I could shake that for 10,000 years. And probably after a month, it's just going to dissolve the box, the shoe, and the shoelace. Things don't create, they degenerate. And then like what you were just saying, everything that people are saying, you need to think, does this even make sense? Like, is there any form of truth in this? And if you're not a Christian, you're listening to this, at least challenge what people are saying, because you're having people say, save the earth from a threat that's not there. And yet they're like, abort a baby, a human life. Why are you saving the earth to save humanity, but you'll kill like that? I mean, that just doesn't make sense. Think about what you're doing. So,
yeah, it's ironic when you need someone like Tom McDonald to put together a rap song that says something along the lines of, save the planet for our children. Why don't we, make better children for our planet? Like he starts one of his raps like that, and I'm like, oh my goodness, mind blown. And I'm like, that's exactly right. We're trying to we're reversing everything in the natural order right now. And it's one of the great, historians are going to look back at our time. I mean, they're going to listen to this podcast. They're going to say, why did they do anything about it? And, I think it's a little harder said. It's harder said than done. And it's easy to point out all the problems going on. It's another thing to, shape culture, because politics is downstream from culture, and we're losing the cultural battle. Mm-hmm. Hands down. Christians, conservatives, people who are overall just kind of like not woke, we're losing the cultural battle, hands down.
And that's why we're not going to solve the world's problems here, but we are going to help people, because what we're saying is going across the world. People are going to listen, and they may say, oh, wow, boom, light bulb goes off. Or maybe they're like, oh, that's exactly what I was having that discussion with my son or daughter or friend, and they're going to forward it. So look at Dave and I, we're trying to reach you and help you grow, not because we're right, but because we're trying to take what we know is truth and help you. And then that all glorifies God. And then you can take this and spread it out to other people and spread it out. And if we each change 1 or 2 lives, the whole world will be a better place. You don't need to go to some foreign country. You can literally do whatever you're going to do at home. If God tells you to go to another country, go, but don't ignore your home, because most people aren't going to leave their home. And it's a huge mission field right now, right where you're at.
And that's the true state, especially in America. I know.
Yeah. There's more people that know. I forget. It made me sick. Like, more kids in school could tell you about Marvel superheroes, like their whole backstory, but they didn't even know who Jesus was.
Yeah.
And that's just a sad reality right now.
I mean, and it's not necessary. It's obviously getting worse, but I was one of those. I was growing up in a semi-religious home, a Christian home, and I couldn't even tell you necessarily like what Jesus's role was. I mean, going back to my young life experience, I got upset when they told me I couldn't do anything for my sin. So yeah, we're living in some interesting political and religious times.
Yeah.
But getting back to my story.
Please do.
Yeah. After I graduated, I went and started doing travel physical therapy. That's actually how I met my wife. I was coming through Pensacola. We met, got married within a year, and then we moved to Colorado, and then we had the opportunity to move to California for 4 years. And it's interesting because here I don't have as much fun doing having conversations, because most people are ideologically very similar to me. Pensacola is a very conservative, Republican, red area. And California, we lived in Santa Rosa, and we were really oddballs, because churches were only like house churches out there. And, what was really interesting too is that churches in California, by and large, are quite strong, because it's countercultural to be a Christian out there. Here in Pensacola, where a lot of people in the Bible Belt, everyone's a Christian and everyone believes in Jesus. But then you've got lukewarmness, which is not all that healthy. But
it's the worst. It's the worst.
Yeah. And then
God himself says, I'd rather be hot or cold, but lukewarm, I want to spew you out of my mouth.
Mm-hmm, that's right. And so in California, we found a really good church we were part of for a couple of years. Again, just living with very, very simple means. And by the time we left, we just couldn't afford it any longer. Expenses got too high. We started having those kids. And so we moved back here to Pensacola. And that's when things really changed a lot for my career, because at that point, my wife and I were going through a lot of changes in the family. Obviously, we had to move across the country, and it was really, there was a lot of challenges that we had to face in our marriage. Not like bad ones, not like no, what are we going to do? Are we going to get divorced or anything? But I think that the challenges that we were facing were how do we address the differences that we have in a way that's productive. My wife and I, we personally aren't, we're not, when we said I do, we said I do for life. There wasn't anything that was going to change our our desires. And with that background, we said to ourselves, okay, well, how do we fix this? Because we're stuck with one another, and we got through those challenges. And I think a lot of that had to do with the addition of our children. It really exposes children are excellent reflectors of your sin, and they're really good at exposing your sin towards your spouse. And so those were things that my wife and I, her name's Beth, had to address along the way and those years leading up to coming back to Pensacola. And I think that the challenge during those years was a lot of taking what I had learned in college and implementing it. I had I'm not going to get into many details, but I had some health issues when I was 30. I'm 36 now, that really took me out. And I think that when that happened, I mean, I was a marathon runner. I mean, I didn't even bring that up, but I've been running marathons for a long time at that point. And when I could barely run 3 miles, I mean, I knew something was wrong, and I was pretty sick. And during that time, what's interesting is when my main symptom was fatigue. I struggled to get through work days and really keep my mind clear. And one of the things that was produced in that was a large apathy towards God, a large apathy towards, my family. Not because, and again, there wasn't a heart issue. It was I was just trying to live. I was just trying to survive. But the enemy creeped in quite a bit, with lies, and kind of creeped in with how I should be thinking about whether it's my family, my wife, or whatnot. And so I think those were probably some of the hardest years for me relationally. And it wasn't until I was healed that the fog lifted, and I can look back and say, oh my goodness. And my wife and I were able to make some of those corrections. But it's interesting to note, when you chop off the head of the family, I think you alluded to it earlier, how much chaos can ensue. And I obviously will take some fault in that. At the same time, it was incredibly difficult to keep my mind even straight with how sick I was. And so,
now, if you don't mind, what did you have and how did you get better?
I'm not going to get into too much what I had. I will say that I did end up having to go through a naturopathic doctor to actually be healed. Let's just say this, if I hadn't been healed, I would have been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. Okay.
Got you. Yeah. I got you.
And it just took me out a big time. I remember I would go to work, and I'd come home after 5 hours, and I'd pass out. I couldn't do it. I was doing home health, which means I was going in my car, driving to homes, and then going to the next home and the next home. And I remember sitting there in my car, working up the energy just to get out to the next person. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to sit here with my eyes closed for 10 minutes just so I can get up and do my job for the next 50 minutes. And that took a toll on us quite a bit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I know we have listeners now that are in the exact same spot. They can't even get off their couch or out of bed, but they're listening to this episode. What would you say to them to kind of help them to get healing? Now, every medical case is different, but to diagnose, to start moving forward, what are some steps you'd recommend to them to get well?
I don't know. I don't know. I feel as though what happened to us is my wife had a friend in our church that was helped by this naturopathic doctor, and the results spoke for themselves. And so we went and sought her advice, and she came up with a diagnosis and helped us get through it. I would say this: I would be extra critical of your medical providers. And we can get into the medical world in a little bit. That's my life right now. It's kind of how I'm living, is running my own medical, my physical therapy practice. But I don't think, in America especially, but I would say most patients are not nearly as critical as they should be of their medical providers. I think we listen to our doctors and say, well, that's a doctor said. Well, guess what? C's get degrees even in medical school.
Yeah, I love it. I just told someone that the other day. I just said, what's the doctor called that graduates first in his class? Doctor. What's a doctor that graduates last in his class or her class? Doctor. That just because you're a doctor doesn't mean you're good at it.
Yeah, and here's another. So I have another problem I have with people is it's not necessarily like, oh, so I really liked him. He was nice. I don't care if your doctor's nice. Does he know what the heck he's talking about? That's what I care about. Is your surgeon steady with the hands? Is your epidemiologist knowledgeable about the most common, viruses and bacterial infections? Like that's what we care about. Is your physical therapist, does he really know how to manipulate the biomechanics of your body to relieve pain? That's what we care about.
Yeah, and do they care? Like there's certain things I've struggled with my entire life. And I just had to write off as, I don't know, I've had a ton of weird stuff happen to me medically, like really intense stuff. But Dr. Sonia Whitaker out of Pensacola, I don't know if you know her. She's over at Sacred Heart. She sat there and listened and cared. And she's like, hey, do you mind if I run some tests? Come to find out I have a genetic disorder. She identified it, put me on a supplement. And after like 44 years, I'm finally starting to feel different and better in a lot of ways. And it was just because she took time to think through and identify what was the cause, not just a symptom she was treating. And it was wonderful to see her.
Yes. And I think that's exactly, you mentioned it, the cause. I think a lot of times the medical world is one, reactive and not preventative. And then number two, it is much more symptom driven than root cause driven. And if you're constantly reacting to symptoms as opposed to being preventative of root causes, we're going to constantly have a sick populace.
Yeah. Like I have a hard time breathing right now. You know why? Because I gained 30 pounds and I'm fat. So when I bend over, I can't breathe the same amount of air in. So there's a cause and effect here. So I don't need a doctor for that. I need to shut my mouth and exercise more,
Well, but then you got to ask yourself, what is it that's causing you to either eat more or exercise less?
Right here, the cabeza, man. It was all mental, all depression and stress.
Well, then there you go. And then you got to ask yourself, why are you depressed?
Exactly. Keep tracking it down till you get the root.
Well, that's my point. And so I think that we can sit here and say, well, just exercise and eat better. Okay, well, that's again a symptom. It's all we're doing is treating a symptom. What we should be doing is saying, hey, look, well, what's the root cause of your let's say your depression. Well, again, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a doctor of physical therapy, two separate things, but let's just go with it. If you've got depression, then the question is, well, why do you have depression? Well, you can have depression for a number of reasons, and your physician should take the time and have the understanding of what are the root symptoms of this and then address it accordingly. You can have a genetic disorder that makes it difficult for your body to produce or reabsorb serotonin and therefore cause depression. So now
that's what I had. I had 0 levels.
Yeah.
They had the chart where you have here's normal, here's mildly, here's moderate depletion. They put moderate with an asterisk, and they said from the company in California, they're like, we've only seen this 2 other times. Like my levels were that depleted, and it was from this genetic disorder.
Yeah. And so, we say all this to say, again, there are reasons for this. And I mean, we can even go into, liver dysfunction. Why aren't you, processing toxins out of your body? So therefore, like, why is that? Well, maybe you have a genetic malformation, or you have genetic coding that's just a little bit disrupted enough to render that protein, useless. And that's what I do in my practice, just from a mechanical perspective with your body, is I don't care where your pain is, and I don't really care, how bad it is. I want to know what's causing it. And a lot of time I tell my patients, I don't treat pain, I treat dysfunction. Dysfunction causes pain. So if I fix that first, the pain will go away. And a lot of times I'll treat something that, today I had a patient this morning. I got home. I was working this morning. Patients are still sick on Memorial Day. And I was treating her, and she's had chronic neck pain for 3 decades. And she goes, I just need you to fix right here. And she kind of held her shoulder and her neck right here. And I said, okay, do you mind if I look around at your shoulders and your shoulder blade today? She goes, I don't mind. And so I figured out that it was mostly her shoulder blade that was the problem. I fixed some of those things, those dysfunctions. And I said, ma'am, can you stand up and move your neck? And she goes, oh my gosh, my pain's gone. What did you do to me? And I told her, I'm like, ma'am, I fixed the root cause of your problem. That's why when you get your massages or when you go to your chiropractor, it always comes back. And the reason why it comes back is they're just treating the symptoms. Listen, nothing wrong with chiropractors, massage therapists. Like they have their roles, and a lot of people, I've referred to them on multiple occasions. I don't have a problem with that. What I do have a problem with is any practitioner treating symptoms and not necessarily understanding where those symptoms are coming from. And so that's in a lot of ways how I've built my practice, is identifying those root causes of problems. And listen, we're talking in the medical world, but the reality is that that's true everywhere. Why do you have the symptom is angry young men? Why do we have angry young men? Well, because we don't have the strict laws, or we don't have good gun laws, or they aren't educated enough when they need to go to college, or those are symptoms, and they do not fix the root cause. You know what the root cause is? Fatherlessness. That's what that is. And that's a generational problem that we have in many communities in America that I really wish that we would actually be willing to address, but it's really hard to have that conversation.
Yeah, and you can replace this with anything equals anything, but like somebody said, guns kill people. Then that's like saying spoons make people fat. Don't be an idiot. That's not true. You know what I mean? The people who want to take away your guns are the people who want control, and then all you have left are criminals with guns, and the innocent are getting their butts kicked. So again, but the same thing. Like, it's any concept. Nothing kills nothing. It's the person. So but go back to your story, Dave. Let's continue in this is awesome. We're having a great conversation, but I want to respect your time, but there's no time. Don't rush. Don't belabor it. Just be you, man. But I want to make sure we keep getting back on the track.
Well, I think we've gotten us pretty much up to the last year or so. What's been really interesting this last year or two was the way that God was working in the development of my business, and a little bit more on the career side of things. 2 years ago, Medicare came out with a PDGM, which is a fancy way of an acronym that I don't know what it means, but of kind of like what it looks like to pay and reimburse for home health services. So my wife and I came back to Pensacola in 2017, end of 2017. We literally ran from the fires after having our son 3 days earlier. We evacuated from the fires and we never returned. We came here. We were kind of planning on it, but we just said, screw it, we're leaving now. So we left, we came here, and I started the job with another physical therapy practice in the area. And long story short, it wasn't a very good fit. I felt like there was a lot of lies being told and poor leadership in the company. So I left, and I took up a home health position again. Again, they pay better, and I was still in debt at the time. So I was like, you know what, I'll just take, if I'm not going to have my perfect job, I'll take a higher paying job. And so I did that for,
I mean, I always tell people that. I'm like, you want to find what God called you to do, what you're passionate about. And normally the money flows when you're there. But in the meantime, as long as it's moral, take the highest paying job you can get and just keep working.
Yeah. And that's what I did. And so I did that for 2019. And at the end of 2019 is when this law was going to be implemented. And what Medicare did is that they essentially changed the way they reimburse for healthcare services in the home health world. And they said, instead of every time you go, I'll give you X dollars, what they said was, give us the diagnosis code and a couple of other factors, and we'll give you a lump sum, and then you deal with it. So, all right, well, what does that look like? Well, let's say I get $4,000 to take care of Miss Sally, who broke her hip, and she comes home from the hospital with a UTI, which is a urinary tract infection, which is a high risk. A lot of people have when they come out of the hospital, unfortunately. Well, we have to pay for nursing to go out there and change the catheters and do all that stuff. We need to pay for occupational therapy, and we also need to pay for physical therapy. And by the way, they also Medicare requires us to pay for all of the DME, which is like walkers and canes and such, and medical equipment such as the catheters. We have to pay for all of that from that $4,000. Well, what that ends up becoming is you get 4 visits for physical therapy and 2 visits for OT and 6 visits for nursing, and you're not allowed to get any more, because what ends up happening is you start losing money when you go beyond that $4,000 mark. And it sounds like, oh, $4,000, that should be plenty. Well, I mean, if you need like 10 visits and you're paying a physical therapist, let's say, $50 an hour, which is a great salary. I'm not saying that very few PTs make that necessarily, but let's just pretend for numbers, you're already pushing like half of that money, in that plan of care just to take care of this person. And you're not even talking about just the PT, but you're talking about OT as well. Well, what ended up happening is my company started making cuts. They said, well, we're not going to see this person 10 times because we would lose money. So you can only do 6 times. So the higher ups started telling me what to do in terms of my plan. I would say, listen, this woman, she fell, but she's not going to be safe to leave the house for at least 12 visits. And they're like, yeah, but you only have 4. And I pushed back. I gave people hard times. It was very unethical in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And that's what's sad. That's the majority of our healthcare system right now. It's a money-making machine that the government and the healthcare companies are in bed together. And it's not about patient care. It's not about what's best. It's not about what's, even statistically average. It's all about how can we spend the least amount of money and collect the most?
Well, I'll push back a little bit. When you say healthcare companies, you probably have to quantify that.
I meant like Humana Insurance and the
insurance companies.
Yeah, insurance companies. I apologize, because in the 50s, what people don't know is the government and the healthcare companies, those companies, insurance companies, they got in bed together, and then Medicare sets the base rates, and everything else is driven by that. Yes. So they're saying it's privatized medicine, but really our socialized healthcare started back then, and it's just growing into a beast, an evil beast every day more and more. It is.
And so you're correct. That good clarification. When you say healthcare, you mean the health insurance companies.
Yeah. And I love that you push back, dude. If I say something you don't agree with, I have no problem disagreeing, but clarification super wonderful. So keep going.
So what ended up happening with me is that I ended up getting a 40% pay cut at the end of 2019. And it was hard because I had just had my 4th child. I had just bought a house, and I was like, you can't do this to me. We had a contract, and they're like, well, you can either sign here or resign. Sign or resign. We don't care. We'll replace you. And so I signed my contract, a new contract for half of what I was making, and from there I was like, okay, what am I going to do, because I'm not going to be able to live off of this. And by the way, 2019, in October of 2019, I was able to pay off the final bill of my student loans. And so I paid $205,000 off in 9 years.
Nice. Good job, man.
Now people are like, oh, well, you're a doctor, you make lots of money. Not necessarily. A majority of that time, I worked a travel position, which had me uprooted every 13 weeks, which I think is not something everyone's willing to do, but you do get paid more for that. I also spent a majority of my time in California working 2 jobs. And so when you think of, oh, doctor makes lots of money, therefore, of course you can pay all that off. No, I didn't go on vacation. I didn't take time off, and I didn't go out and spend money on filet mignon that I could do next week. The reality was that I spent my money on only the necessities, and my wife and I would have monthly conversations about what we're spending our money on intentionally so that we can pay off my student loans quicker. And so there is much more sacrifice than having a bigger shovel than I think people realize. Side note. So after I had to change my contract, I ended up trying to brainstorm, well, maybe I'll get a second job. Like I've done that before. I couldn't find any jobs because PTs were being laid off because of this. You think about, if you need physical therapy right now, you probably have a waiting list. There's probably not enough. There's a national shortage of physical therapists. And here we are laying physical therapists off because we can't afford to pay them because Medicare cut things so bad that we can't even provide the right therapy for people.
Yep. And that's, again, Medicare. It goes back to the government. And then they charge $30 for a damn aspirin, but then they cut what people need and they wonder why. So you know what? I want to add a side note. Anybody listening, this is an American law. I don't know which countries enforce it internationally, but I don't know if you know this, Dave, but if you're ever in that situation to sign a contract and you're really being strong-armed or forced, you put a VC in your signature. Did you know that?
No.
Yeah. I don't want to mispronounce it. It's V coactus. And when you put a VC in your signature, it's saying, I'm signing this because I feel like I have no other option. And then you can go back in court and say, I can't leave my family homeless. I had to sign it, but I was being forced to essentially, they're going in that gray area. So in America, if you sign at VC, you can absolutely go back and refute that contract. So for not just for you, but for all the listeners in America, that's a little legal tip that they don't want you to know, those bastards.
Yeah. So, I felt like I was being strong-armed a little bit. I didn't have any options. So I did what I had to do. But during that time, there was a couple friends that in my church that needed physical therapy. One was in a pretty bad car accident, and a few other people having some back pain that I was willing to treat for free. And my one friend was like, Dave, you just need to do this on your own. And I'm like, no, I can't, I can't, lots of problems. And I don't want to have to, do all the things. And I don't know how it looks to, start a business. And I don't know what it looks like to take insurance. And it's really hard to do. And I have to pay a biller. And there's so much risk involved. He actually did some legwork for me. He said, look, Dave, you can take cash, you can do cash physical therapy, and you can even just do it out of your car. And I was like, let me look into this. And so what it turns out and what it turned into is I started my own practice at the beginning of 2020. And it's called Renew Concierge Physical Therapy. And the idea is that we're going to take the middleman, the insurance company, out of the equation. And I'm just going to market directly to the consumer, the patient. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to solve problems that no one else can solve. And the great thing about my practice is that if I'm not good at getting you the results you want, you'll fire me because you're paying out of pocket. You're not going to pay out of, you're not going to be able to pay out of pocket. You're not going to pay me out of your own pocket for a service that you don't feel is very beneficial. Right. And so really it's best for everybody. The reason why I went we call it a cash-based route or the self-pay route is because of all the problems with the insurance companies. See, I don't think people realize this, but as a medical provider, in order to accept your Humana or your United or Florida Blue, I need to enter a contract with that insurance company, and they'll say, we'll pay you X dollars per visit, whatever that is, $50, $60. And that's it. I can't charge you more. But what if I'm better? Or what if I want to, keep my lights on? Well, sorry, you signed a contract. You don't have to take our patients, but if you do, you have to go along with this monetary amount that we've agreed to. I'm like, I didn't agree to it. I liken it to this. Imagine going to Best Buy or go to your favorite electronics store. You walk in, you see the price tag of $1,000 for a TV, but you walk out with it and you give somebody a $20 bill. and then they go, but we don't, that's $1,000. We don't charge $20. It's $1,000. And then you saying, yeah, I know, but I'm only willing to pay 20. So that's what you have to take. That's kind of the way the medical system works with insurance companies and Medicare. Is Medicare sets the rate and you either take it or leave it. And if you don't take it, you leave it, that means you don't have access to their huge network of people.
Yep. And they can change the rates midstream. So what you budgeted and counted on, they cut from you. It's an absolute scam. It's one of the largest. It's a large scale scam. That's what it is.
Well, what ends up happening is clinics. So your normal physical therapy practice will operate at around 6% profit margin. Now, anyone who's business savvy out there will know this, but I'll let you guys, that's a very small margin. You should probably be in the 20 to 30% profit margin if you've got a business. Obviously, the higher, the better. If you're running a business and your mind is only set on money, you definitely want it to be higher. But, physical therapy practices don't make very much money. I wasn't kidding when, the average PT will make anywhere from $70,000 to $90,000 a year. That's kind of the average rate that we would make. And if you break it down, that's somewhere around $36 to $42 an hour. Okay. The problem with this is that if you were to look at some of the contracts that these commercial insurances, so that's non-federal, Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, those kinds of plans are federal. The commercials are Florida Blue Cross Blue Shield, Aetna, Cigna, those kinds of guys. They only reimburse like $50-$60 a visit for an hour session. So if you're looking at it, you're like, well, I've got to pay my PT $42 an hour and I'm only taking in $50. That means my profit margin is $8. That doesn't count rent. It doesn't count marketing. It doesn't count. I have to pay my biller $50,000 a year. I mean, it all adds up, and you're just not making enough money.
Yeah, so malpractice insurance, all sorts of other government mandated insurances.
Taxes. I mean, I might pay a physical therapist $40 an hour, but I'm actually paying $40 to him and then $43 because the taxes above the payroll taxes above that. I mean, the reality is that you're really skimping if you're doing one patient per hour. So what these physical therapy practices will do, and again, this is why I'm saying, like, I'm not going to sit here and berate and make my other colleagues in the medical world, I'm not going to harp on them, but what they intend to do is double up on patients. So instead of seeing one person for $50 an hour, I'm going to see two. That means I'll make $100 in the hour, and now my profit margin starts to increase. So in my mind, I call that just a PT mill. We're just herding cattle, because when you do that, you actually don't have an opportunity to do some of the things that are really necessary for your clients. So for example, I'm a manual trained therapist. That means I put my hands on you, whether it's manipulating or mobilizing the spine or the joints, or doing soft tissue, like some type of massage techniques or release techniques. That's what I put my hands on you to correct the problems. I can't do that but to one person at a time. So if I was doing the right thing in my mind for people, that means what I'm doing is doing the wrong thing for two others, because it's usually 2 or 3 people at a time in these clinics. Or what I'm doing is exercise for everybody, and you only get maybe 80% better. And if you're getting 80% better, well, you get what you pay for.
Yeah. And for Dave and I talking, I'm passionate about this because any kind of moral injustice pisses me off. But I'm also self-pay, and I have been for years. But my daughter just had, this is a great illustration, she just tore her knee on soccer, had to have surgery, had to have physical therapy. And what Dave and I are talking about, we're not talking about at the doctor level, the problem's at. It's the organization level, and the hospital level, and the insurance company level, and all to the government level. It's just this high-end greed. Because I remember being at my doctor's physical therapy, and they're doing exactly what you're saying. They had actually 3 or 4 patients each, and they're jumping around, and they're using kind of to help each other, like a cooperative approach. And yeah, I understand what they're doing, but they're doing it because they have to. Those PTs know they're not giving the best care, and they want to give the best care, but they're going to get fired if they give the best care. And I remember this one guy, he was one of the senior guys, and he had to like run to the bathroom because he had so many clients, and then like alarms were going off because everybody was so busy. And it's like he can't even take time to go to the bathroom between clients because the pressure the insurance companies put on them to turn patients. So listen,
just to be clear though, you said it's the insurance companies putting on patients, the pressures from the insurance company. That's not true. It's indirectly from the insurance company.
Yeah, the hospital organization is putting, you have to turn this many patients, but what I'm saying is because they want more money from the insurance company. It's all
correct.
It's a sick, broken cycle. So you're actually solving that cycle, even though it seems like more money. Talk about what you're doing and how that's really helping people.
Well, think of it like this. If you've got the 4 people running around, and listen, Dave and I, you and I didn't even talk about that. I didn't even know that your daughter had that ACL, and here we are. I'm literally speaking to the very thing that you experienced. And now you're like, oh, that resonates. The reality
I wish we talked 3 months ago.
Well, hey, now you know. The reality is the way it works is, instead of me going to the insurance company and negotiating a rate that's actually detrimental to my business, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go directly to you, the patient, and say, listen, these are my rates. And so, when I set my rate based on the quality in which I want to give you. Now, there are excellent physical therapists, excellent doctors that take insurance, and I'm not discouraging you from using them. If you have benefits, I mean, it's worth a shot. The problem is that a lot of times physical therapy gets a bad rap because we don't get good outcomes. We don't get good outcomes, not because physical therapy doesn't work. It's because physical therapy is working in a system that is unable to produce the outcomes that we can get because of the constraints that we have. And that's what's really frustrating with all of this the medical upheaval that we have in our country, is everyone's saying, oh yeah, the doctors and the physical therapists, whoever it is, they're rich and they just want more money. No, we're struggling. Okay. If you go to school to be a medical doctor and you're a primary physician, you're making $150,000 a year. Listen, that is great if you're only making $30,000. You're comparing it to a lower paying job or somebody who's working at a minimum wage. You probably make 25, 30,000. I understand that, but you also need to realize that in the business world, we ought to be paid a rate commiserate to the problems that we're solving. If you're solving the problem of flipping a burger, or if you're solving the problem of something that people can do on a wide number of skill sets, like everyone has that same skill set. Listen, I don't make $1 million a year, but you know what? That one guy in the NBA that can shoot a ball into a basket, which isn't really that helpful to the world, is making more to me because he's solving the problem of putting the ball in the basket a lot better than I can ever do. All right. And you know what? It's also not fair. I'm only 5'8". I'm not going to be in the NBA no matter how good I shoot that ball, and the reality is that we are given certain gifts, from God. Some people are smart. Some people are tall. Some people are fast. Some people are very specific. I don't think I'm all that intelligent, although I do believe I am gifted in physical therapy. I say all to say, if you've got a primary care physician, he's only making like $150 a year, and he had to go to like 10 years of school for that after high school, and he had to invest more money than I did in his education, and he has to pay that off. And insurance companies are saying, well, we don't really value that. And so what's he going to do? He's just going to see as many patients as he can for 5 or 10 minutes, because everyone's experienced that, and you're going to be sent to a specialist. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either. But you also have to realize that, you're not getting the highest level of care when the physician is spending as much time documenting as he is spending time with you. With what I want to do is, instead of doing 4 patients at a time, I'm going to see 1 person at a time. And I'm going to give you such good care during that 1 hour that you, instead of needing, David, how many visits did your daughter need from physical therapy? probably in the 12 to 20 range.
Yeah, she had major surgery. She had anchors put in, an inner brace, and man, I mean, I lost count. I just pay the bills.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
I mean,
so here's the thing. Instead of doing like 20 visits.
Yeah, she had at least 20. I mean, for sure. 'Cause she was going 3 times a week. And I mean, we just went to the doctor 2 days ago to get the follow-up, check in on it. But yeah, it's a lot.
So David, most likely I would have taken the 3 times a week and given her 1 day a week. And would have given you, and I'm assuming what happened is she went to the gym and they made her do a bunch of exercises.
Yeah, and I actually do want to point this out for those of you listening, because you mentioned physical therapy is judged harshly and the results are judged harshly. It's not just because the therapists are overworked and not even giving the best care, because you have some great physical therapists who are giving amazing care and
That's
are
true.
teaching the right exercises, but results depend on the patient too.
That's true.
Like when you say my kid's falling behind in school, okay, we have a broken school system. Everybody knows we have a broken school system, but it's still your kid. You're responsible for your kid's education. Your kid is responsible for their education. There's such a lack of personal accountability that when people go to physical therapy, but then they don't do any exercises until they come back, that's their fault too. So we need to have personal accountability, and we can't judge our doctors while we're getting better. And if we have a good quote, bad doctor, it's still our responsibility to find our issues ourselves and get better.
I would say, and that's the thing I do, is I'm very intentional about saying, listen, I'm just a piece of the puzzle. I'm a guide. My job is to come alongside you and help you achieve your goals. Now, the good thing about a cash-based practice or a self-pay practice is that people who come to me truly want to get better. They're not going to spend $150 a visit with me, saying, hey, I'm not interested in getting better, And I know, let's say $150 is a lot higher than your $50 copay. But Dave, if you have 20 visits at $50 copay, but you only see me 9 times, same price.
Yeah, and I'm self-pay, and I think I want to say, I literally block it out. I want to say the visits were billed to me at $600 or $600 a visit, and then they give you the self-pay rate. And what's crazy is I'm paying more than the insurance companies who are corrupt that set the rates, and the government. It's just such a broken system.
Yeah, most of the client, and that's a good, interesting point. So yeah, you should have met me a while ago.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not trying to rub salt in the wound, but trust me, I want to I feel like breaking some knees when I get these bills.
Yeah. So what we would do, so the problem with an insurance-based practice is that they're not set up to house someone like yourself. What they're designed to do is to bill the insurance companies at these exorbitant rates and then write off the rest of the money. So, they might charge $600, but only get reimbursed $75. Now, in your case, they are they're saying $600 and we'll give you your self-pay rate at $250. But that's what they have to do.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous. Everybody knows it's ridiculous, but yet they won't budge. So I pay more than the insurance company. That's just wrong.
Yeah, and so what I want to do is I want to take a higher level quality, and that's the thing is a lot of people go, well, Dave, how did you do this? Well, I don't sell physical therapy. Everyone has physical therapy. Who wants physical therapy is not what I sell. What I sell is an experience attached to an outcome. That's what I want for you. So for example, instead of going, 3 times a week for a month, 2 months, and, doing these exercises that you can do at home, what's your experience like with me? I'll come once a week. I will do the manual therapy techniques that are required to make the exercises that I give you much more efficient. And I'll leave you to do your exercises once I check and make sure you're doing things well. And then on a weekly basis, I'll say, okay, now tweak it, now tweak it, now tweak it, now tweak it. Meanwhile, the experience is in the comfort of your own home. I don't need a gym. I don't need fancy equipment. I never have. I never will. And now listen, do I have some higher level athletes that I work with? Yes. Do at some point I do need to get you in a gym? Yes. And that's something I have available to me in other venues. I can work out of a gym. on an occasion, but mostly 99% of my clients and all of my visits are mostly in people's home, in the comfort. You don't have to fight traffic. And that's why I call it, concierge physical therapy. It's about you. And so for you, David, and your daughter, I don't work for insurance companies. I work for you, which means your goals are the top priority. I don't have to worry about documentation to make sure I get paid. I'll just write down what I need to, which is a lot less than what they require. And then I can focus more of my time and energy on you. When I was working in outpatient, I was seeing about 15 to 17 patients a day. Now I only see 6 at most. And because I only see 6 people a day at most, gives me about anywhere from 10 to 15 patients on my caseload at a time. It actually gives me the opportunity for you not to be a number. And I don't think people value that as much because you don't necessarily realize how much us medical professionals are under so much stress. When I was working in the last outpatient clinic that I was working at, I was responsible for 150 people at any given time. About 70 were on my schedule and about 80 were on my physical therapy assistant schedule. And I was responsible for the care of all of them. And no one has the brain power or the bandwidth to manage all of that.
No, absolutely not. It's like in management of a business. You should never really manage more than 8 to 12 people because you just can't effectively do it. You need to have sub-management. And look at that. The Bible, once again, how many disciples did Jesus have, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Bible's always perfect. But yeah, I can't believe what they put you through and put other doctors through and other physicians through. It's just unmanageable. It's not even real.
And what hurts is that it's the patients that pay for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you get this doctors that get completely detached and they don't care anymore because they've been run through the mill. But well, let's do this. Let's continue. Let's wrap up your story from anything we've missed from your birth to where you are today. Anything we missed in there that you want to fill in before we transition to where Dave is today and where you're going?
Yeah. Well, we can make that transition pretty easily. So at this point, that's what my company is. Last year, I started a practice at the worst possible time to start a business in world history. I saw my first client in February, and then I was fired March 9th from my full-time job. And a week later, everything shut down last year. And so I was in a place where I'm like, okay, God, I had all the systems in place. I had my documentation system ready. I had a plan. I had formed a small council to refer to. So again, their plans succeed in where there is lots of counsel. Okay. I think there's a couple different scriptures I just conflated there, but the reality is that the Bible is very clear. A good king or a good leader in this case is going to be someone who seeks the counsel of others. So I had 3 people, men of God, that I asked to be a part of this process for me, and they were absolutely sold on it. And I started my business essentially in March. I saw like 1 or 2 people in February. My company was like, "Oh, you started a business. We're going to fire you." They said it was not a breach of contract. They said
conflict of interest.
Conflict of interest, which they only take Medicare. They don't take any other insurance, and I don't take any insurance. So and by law at the time, my understanding was I couldn't take Medicare patients either, which is another issue in the law. But essentially, there was no conflict of interest. But they were happy to find a reason to fire me because I know I was a pain in their butt. But I was a pain in their butt because I'm going to speak out when people are being, absolutely just backhanded about how they treat others and how they go about the integrity of the business. And, they were happy to get rid of me. And so I had no job, new house, new baby in 2020 in a pandemic. And I had to figure out a way. And I just got fired, so there was no unemployment coming my way. And so I had to figure out a way to make money quickly. And so it was a lot of networking. It was a lot of listening to my counsel. And March, April, May, June, month over month over month, my revenue doubled. And I attribute that a lot to God's favor. I alluded to it earlier about Dr. Jim Harris when he wrote a book called The Unfair Advantage. I really believe that if you listen to the Holy Spirit, he's going to tell you who to talk to, and he's going to tell you how to run your business. He's going to tell you what to do in the benefit of you. And during this time, I learned what it was like to work hard but not strive. And I found that when I was striving, things didn't work out so good. I didn't get as many clients or as many referrals. But then as I took a step back and I said, no, God, this is you. You're going to do this for me. All of a sudden I got calls. I got clients. And, I think that was the main thrust of it all, is me learning what it was look like to work hard but not strive. And when I say strive, I mean toil. And the scriptures talk about toiling. And it was actually something that, we need to veer away from. And if you're toiling, what you're saying is, I don't trust God to take care of this, so I will do this on my own strength. And obviously Proverbs says, lean not on your own understanding, but trust in God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I need to trust God that he told me that this is a good thing to do and that he's going to make this work. And so by the time June rolled around last year, I had a full schedule. And this is from nothing. And this is trying to sell something that people can get for free, or, well, relatively free, a lot cheaper if you have insurance. And I think this also speaks to another thing that the Bible talks about, which is see a man excellent in his work, he'll sit before kings. If you're a Christian, even if you're not a Christian, but if you're a Christian, whatever it is that you do, you must do unto the Lord, and you must do in excellence. You must serve the people that you're serving, or treat whatever it is that you're doing, whether you're a trash picker or a garbage guy, or a doctor, or a lawyer, you're flipping burgers, whatever it is that you're doing, you ought to be doing it with excellence. You should do it to the best of your ability every time, because what happens is that hard work and that dedication translates to better opportunities. And I think that, on a practical sense, one, you're succeeding and honoring God with your obedience. But then two, in a practical worldly way, if you're working hard at doing something little, you will be rewarded with something greater. And that's where I'm sure we can go on a massive tangent about minimum wage and what that looks like. But ultimately, if you can succeed with lower paying jobs, you will be presented with larger paying jobs, as long as you're practicing excellence as you go. And in regards to my practice, I practiced excellence. I put everything I have into every single patient to make sure, like, I take it personally when people aren't necessarily getting better. I need to switch what I'm doing, which happens, on a regular basis. You start with a hypothesis, you treat it, and it doesn't really work out. So then you have to change, and you gotta pivot a little bit to find the root cause. Maybe you're not on that precisely the way you want it to be. In July, I hired an assistant, like an executive assistant. September, I hired my first physical therapist. November, I hired my second physical therapist. And then this past month, I hired my third physical therapist. He starts with me 1 week from today.
Nice. Congratulations.
Thank you. And you say congratulations, and I say thank you, with the understanding that I did not earn this. I was blessed with it because God's favor was upon me for my obedience and love and my relationship with him. And people can say I'm crazy. That's fine. I'm happy to be crazy and have a successful business and a successful marriage and great kids and all the blessings that I have in my life. If you noticed a theme throughout my life, it is this: I didn't do anything all that special. I didn't get a girl pregnant when I was in high school. I got a job when I graduated. I finished high school. I worked hard, and I sought out the counsel of others that are wiser than myself. Anyone Anyone can do that. You don't have to have an IQ of 150 to just listen to some wise people. And it doesn't mean you take everyone's advice, but what it does mean is you heed the counsel and listen to the wisdom that someone else might have. And it doesn't mean they have to have gray hair. It doesn't mean they have to necessarily be older than you. In fact, one of the guys on my council is younger than me. My council, my support group, the guys that have helped me make business decisions. One of them is a year younger than me and is a lot less educated in terms of, college and doctors and stuff like that. And I count all that as loss. I don't see me being a doctor to be anything, oh, wow, look at that. What it is, though, is a title that I can use to better serve my patients and people. Like, you do need an education. You do need to have some kind of skill set in order to do a lot of things. And so with my practice, I really get to use the fullness of my doctorate because I don't have the constraints of the medical world bearing down on me.
That's awesome, man. I'm so happy for you. Yeah, like you're saying, God gives us the vision, but we have to put the effort in. We have to do our best and accept our best and leave the rest to him. So that's it's so beautiful to see your prosperity and growth. Now, for those listening, when they have this vision and they see the opportunity, what are some practical steps that, whether God showed you directly or whether he showed you through your counselor, what are the steps to take? Now, necessity is the mother of invention. In your case, you kind of had the fire behind you. But what are some steps to really, that you learned the hard way fast, that our listeners can do to start their own business or practice or get out of that rut?
Well, I'm just going to assume you're a Christian, because if you're not, you need to become one first. That's number one. Okay. You need to understand that there is a God that absolutely loves you and will do anything. Listen, if you have an earthly father and he knows how to give you good gifts, how much more will your heavenly father be able to give you good gifts? The reality is that there is a loving, loving father that wants nothing but awesomeness for you. It's one of my greatest joys to give my girls like ice cream, because they just love ice cream. And it's so simple to them, but I love having them have joy. If I am a sinful man and I know how to give my daughter good gifts, how much more will the Father in heaven be able to do that? And so first and foremost, you need to recognize that there is a Father in heaven that absolutely loves you and wants to have a relationship with you. If you've already met that step, well done. You are already more prosperous than you will ever know. In terms of practical steps in the world, what we can do, again, when you first start your business, pray first. Pray. Ask the Father, what is this going to look like? Give me that vision. What is it that you want, Father God? Because here's the thing, it doesn't matter what you want. It matters what God wants. Because if you can align your heart with the vision that the Father has for your life, there's nothing that's stopping that. If you have a vision for any kind of business, check yourself and make sure it's actually what God wants for you, because it might not be. There are avenues that we can take that seem good and right to the world, but it might be foolishness to God. And then the ways of man may seem wise in his heart, but again, it might be foolishness to God. And so I think you pray first, and then be led by the Spirit. So actually be constantly following what he's calling you to do. And I know those are all very religious and faithful answers. Practically, it's very simple to get a business license. It's very simple to register with the government to open that up. It's very simple to get an LLC. All you got to do is go online and fill out a couple papers. I did it last year. I did it over Christmas break. I think I actually did it on Christmas, like in my on my couch, with my mouse, just clicking a button. Once you have that, I feel like it's real, and I think that there's a mental shift. Once you have like paperwork that says I am a business, it shifts. And now you actually believe it's real, and you can actually start moving forward. I think another practical step is separating out your finances. Any income that your business brings in, have it separated into a separate bank account. That way you kind of know what you're dealing with your expenses and what you're dealing with. Everything should be operating out of that separate account. Once you have your structure and your concept ready to go, I knew right from the get-go my biggest problem was going to be marketing. How do I market myself? And there's Facebook ads, there's Google, YouTube, there's podcasts, and there's lots of ways to market yourself. And what I found to be the most helpful is that people do business with those that they know, like, and trust. That means in-person networking, which is really easy to do during a 2020 pandemic.
Yeah, right.
But the reality is that despite the hardships of the pandemic, I still had opportunities to meet people either on Zoom or in other networking opportunities. There's just some things I was able to do. But by and large, if you go out there with a passion for whatever your business is, I really believe that people can see that and will say, okay, man, he's really passionate. Listen, if you ask me, hey, Dave, do you want to work with a dry cleaner that's not passionate or a dry cleaner that is passionate about no wrinkles? I'm going to go with the person that's passionate. And if you have that passion, you have to let it out. And I would say you probably, if you've been listening or watching this all the way, you probably saw Dave was less passionate. And then you have Dave talking about medical stuff, and now he's passionate. Like, that's where I'm passionate about more so than any other topic. And that comes across as, okay, I can trust him. And I think that's really important, that people will do business with those that they know, they like, and they trust. And you get to that trust point by just building relationships. It's not about going out to someone and saying, hey, listen, I've got a honey, I have a honey farm and I want to sell you my honey. Like, no, why don't you just go and hang out and be go to someone else's business and, buy their stuff first. Or, for me, as a physical therapist, maybe what I'll do is I'll go to the gym and, make friends at the gym. And people who are getting injured, I'll say, oh yeah, I can help you with that. Or for me, a lot of my client base really grew out of my church. And so I made a name for myself in my church, and now everyone comes to me and says, I need to see you. The reality is that when people know and like and trust you, they're going to come to you first. And so I think if you're going to do yourself a favor with marketing, that's the thing that you have to do, is you need to go out there and make sure people know, like, and trust you.
Yeah, I am a marketing and sales guy. That's what I've done for my whole career. And what Dave's saying is dead on. So great advice, great foundational business blocks you've shared with us, man. Thank you.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Between, again, the beginning and where you are today, is there anything else we missed, anything else we didn't talk about that you want to cover before we transition to where are you going and how can we help you get there?
Yeah, I think we've covered it pretty. I'm surprised we've been going a long time, but I'm happy to continue.
Yeah, man, that's been great. That's the format of our show. There's no time limit, and people know they can turn on and off as they go, and they come back and finish the episode. So, question, I don't even know the answer to this. The God TV, what did you discuss on that? Was it the same thing we're talking about today? Was it starting a business? What was that about?
So, yeah, I had the opportunity to be interviewed on God TV, which is, again, another international, they're very big internationally, by Rick Marshall, who has written a book called God at Work. And he's also God at Rest. I think he even wrote a second, God at Work #2. I think he's big about the Christian and the entrepreneurial world and what it looks like. And so I was asked to be on his show, and it hasn't aired yet. But essentially, we took that time. It's a 30-minute interview to discuss how God has been faithful in my business. And we really discussed, again, a little bit of what we touched on, which is, how did I grow a business that normally is paid for by a third party during a pandemic to the point where I didn't have any clients, pandemic hits, everything shuts down, and then month over month grow to the point where I've been able to hire 3 doctors underneath me, all in a matter of a year. And I did this in the time in which, in a time in which most PT practices are shutting down, physical therapists are being laid off. Everyone's losing their jobs. Everyone's going virtual. And all these small businesses, which is me, I'm a small business, are closing down. And I really attribute again to the favor of God. Listen, I talked about, getting out there and in-person networking. Listen, there's favor upon you as a Christian. And I felt that so strongly this year. And I felt like this last year, I felt like Gideon, God's like, that's too many, and so he wanted to make this last year seem so insurmountably impossible, to do on your own, that it was so you couldn't say, hey, Dave does a great job. He's a physical therapist. He fixes everybody. And it's all based on how good he is. He's such a great marketer. The success that I've seen is so great in the face of such great odds that you can't say, oh yeah, the 300 really, they were just such good warriors. They just destroyed the tens of thousands of people after them. No, that's not possible. And I feel like that's, I think, really important to note, that I really believe that the favor of God was upon me throughout this. I would meet with one person, and then that person would see me, and then that person would turn into 3 more patients. And then those 3 patients would see me, and then those 3 patients each gave me 3 more clients, and so forth and what have you. And it just kind of grew. And, I think along this journey, I spent time most Monday mornings in what I would consider a strategic intercession for my business. And what does that mean? That means I'm specifically asking God, what do you want me to do this week? Who do you want me to see? What is it that you have in store for me? What do you want with your business? And, I always tell people that Renew is just an entity in which for me to serve. Now, is it a business? Do I need to make money? Do I need to pay my bills? Do I need to provide for my family? Do I need to pay payroll now? Yes, of course I do. Yes, but it's first and foremost a ministry. I get to talk about Christ with my patients. I get to pray over them. I pray for them as I drive to their homes. This is a ministry. I've had the opportunity to minister to my employees. It just so happens that all of my employees are believers, and so that means I get to speak into their lives in a ministerial way. And, that's important to me. That's how I'm going to run this business. And I took the time on God TV to kind of outline what that looked like. And it's the more you look at my business, I think the more you would see the footprint of God. And if you don't, it's either you're blind or, you're just not looking hard enough.
That's awesome, man. So where's Dave today, and where are you going so we can help you as listeners get there?
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, I'm going to start training my 3rd PT next week, which is good because I've been working really hard. So, I think people think, oh, business owner, you're making all this money and you're doing all these things. And in fact, I don't think I look back at 2020. I was blessed enough to make enough to pay my bills. But this year, I'm really hoping that I maybe even have the opportunity to triple what I did last year with the help of my colleagues. And one of the things that I don't think people realize is that I averaged about 12 to 14 hours of work a day last year. I just want that to sink into those that think that small business owners are reaping, reaping all this money.
You just work an hour a day and go to the beach for the rest, right?
Oh yeah, of course.
That's total sarcasm if you can't figure that out.
Yeah, my hourly rate was definitely worse last year than ever before. But this year it's going to be different, because I won't have to. I'm still, today I saw some clients. I've got about 30 people on my schedule this week. So I am quite busy, but with the help of my colleagues, I'm going to be able to offload some of that caseload so that they can live their dream. Because the reality is, I'm not the only physical therapist burnt out with the system. And there's lots of people. In fact, the PT that's starting with me next week is moving from West Virginia to come down here because he sees the value in being able to treat the patient, not let the patient be the product of a system that fails them. And, how can you help me? Well, I've got all that help I need from God. I'm good. I know I'm good. If you need help, we're here to help too. I know around the world, we can't necessarily treat around the world. And I know telehealth, we could do some of that. However, we need to have a license in the state in which you live in order for us to treat you. So most likely, if you're not in Florida, we can't help you from a physical perspective, even on telehealth. However, I will say this. This isn't about me being helped by you and your listeners. I would much rather people be blessed by just this testimony and the how learning how good God is and being encouraged to step forward in faith. I think entrepreneurism is by far the best thing to kill poverty. If you want to be out of poverty, open your own practice, open your own business, and start selling something that people need and want. And you can sell trinkets. I mean, what was it, like 2 years ago? Like someone came up with a fidget spinner. Like, what the heck?
And overnight, it was this massive thing.
And listen, you don't have to come up with like this. You don't have to have all these skills. You don't have to have these great ideas. All you need to do is solve problems for people. I mean, I know I've got people who start lawn care businesses. You don't need too much skill in that to start. Now, listen, there's some people that just know how to push a mower, and then there's some people that know how to do all the good stuff and take care of lawns. I'm sure. But my point, though, is that you can start off real small. In fact, my brother, who fast forward a couple decades after some of the troubles he's been in, started his own business last year mowing lawns, and he started with a push mower. And then he made $2,000 and he bought himself a tractor. And then he made another $2,000 and he invested in more, and like another weed whacker and then a truck. And he's investing in himself. And help me by helping, taking what I'm giving you and putting it into practice, putting it into words, and it doesn't have to be in the business sense. It can be in the personal life. Help me by storing up treasures in heaven for me by you using my testimony. I think that's how I would be blessed, is that if somebody took away something from this testimony and said, wow, Dave was able to be blessed by God, I can be too. Because what really is important to me is that our country as a whole gets back on track with the joblessness. I think that it's really important that we, get back to work, and I think people need to get away from the victim mentality quite a bit. And if you can get away from that, man, that would bless me in such an amazing way.
That's right. Yeah. And thank you so much. And you've helped us for a couple hours now. So I want to be able to help you, and you're still giving back to our audience. So thank you. Yeah. And I know before the show, we even talked about a special offer you wanted to leave for our remarkable community. But before you do, I want to mention this. Dr. Dave can't legally give you medical advice in many states. However, he can coach you, and that's completely legal. So, right. Dr. Dave, go ahead, and you told me about the offer you want to offer our community, and thank you for it. And for the listeners out there, you can write it down. You can go right on your phone. If you're driving, don't do that. It'll be in the show notes. Come back and get it when you're safely parked. Go ahead, doctor.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. If you're in the Pensacola area, we also have a location in Fort Walton and Panama City. So if you are in those locations, we normally charge $170 for evaluations. That's 75 minutes long. If you wanted to get an evaluation, and just mention this podcast, and that $170 eval is only going to be $50. Okay.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah. We have a
Yeah.
couple, I think we have active in the Pensacola city, not even all the surrounding. We have over 1,200 people actively listen to the podcast. So hopefully if you're listening and you need PT, or if you want to avoid needing PT, go get PT.
Yeah. Yeah, and listen, you're gonna get the best. I would like to believe the best physical therapy experience that you'll ever have with Renew. That's my vision. You know, Dave, you asked about what that vision looks like going forward. I want to be the premier physical therapy practice where people are saying, I know it's a little bit more expensive, but I also know I'm going to save myself more money in the long run. And I think that's exactly what we're referring to when we talked about, delayed gratification. You could spend $1,000 with my practice and get yourself back in order. And what you're doing is you're delaying the gratification of other things so that you can be wise about your physical health now. And, so obviously if you hear about us and you want us to come directly to your home or place of business, the $50 evaluation, it's a very low risk for you to at least find out the root cause of your problem. We'd be happy to do that in our 3 locations. If you're abroad, I'll make sure David has my email address. And if you have any questions that you're dealing with, just like David said, I'd be happy to answer some basic questions or at least point you in the right direction with some of your medical problems. I'd be happy to do that for free. It is, when I first started my practice, I said, God, who do I want to work with? And what I said, God, I want to work with athletes. I want to work with runners. I got that running background. I'm a marathon runner. I want to be able to, really do all this stuff. And God says, no. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And he said, I want you to work with chronic pain patients. And I was like, that's hard. Are you sure? Are you sure you want this guy? Cause that's hard. And he goes, no, I want you to work with chronic pain. And I asked, well, why is that? And he says, David, I need you to go heal my people so they can worship me. And it might sound crazy, but it turns out that God was right. That was where I should have been. And listen, whether you're a chronic pain PT or, working with triathletes, we all use the same techniques. It's just some things are a little harder than others. Sometimes there's a little bit more of a puzzle with the chronic pain versus someone running too much and has some tendonitis in his knee or something. But I've very much enjoyed this journey this last year, working with people who have sought out medical professionals without the results they're looking for. There have been multiple people that I and my team have been able to get off of pain medications that they've been on for 20 years. In fact, this past month, I was able to help a patient avoid neck surgery. She had it scheduled for June 1st, and she is not getting her surgery tomorrow. She canceled it last week.
Nice.
I know, it's a win, man. Anytime you can avoid surgery, it's a win.
And if somebody doesn't know that, you want to avoid all surgeries unless you absolutely need it. But when it comes to neck and back, that is literally their last resort. That's
right. It is. It absolutely is. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, is that they go see the medical world and they might see 2 surgeons for a second opinion, but no one ever gets a second opinion for a physical therapist. And I guess with your listeners here, you're going to have a second opinion for $50. And, if we really are getting the right outcomes, if we are growing this much, we are practicing excellence. And that's really important to me. Going forward, I don't know if the franchise world is the right for me. If the only way I would ever franchise is if there is a way to maintain the quality that I want to offer. And I don't know if that's a way, if there is a way to systemize that a little bit more. Maybe it is. But I think that ultimately I want to be able to change the way people view physical therapy because they're getting the results they actually are paying for.
You are awesome, my brother. Well, Dave, thank you for being here today. You truly are a remarkable guy. I look forward to remaining friends and growing our friendship. And we're right in Pensacola, so this should be easy, right?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a lot. We've gone deep and wide in what we've covered as usual. I know this was a longer episode, but I think it was worth it. Take this episode, share it with people. Again, the most important thing is our eternity. Dave and I talked a lot about that. If you have questions, reach out to Dave and I. If you have physical therapy questions or medical questions, Dave gave a great offer, $50. Also give him an email and he'll be able to help you as much as he can. So like our slogan says, don't just listen to this great content, but do it each day, repeat it each day so that you can have a great life in this world and in the eternity to come, which really matters because this is only a grain of sand compared to everything. So I'm David Pasqualone. This is the Remarkable People Podcast. Dr. Dave, you truly are remarkable. Thank you for being here. And to all our listeners all around the world, we love you. Listen to this episode, listen to other episodes, and we'll see you next week. Ciao.
The Remarkable People Podcast. Check it out. The Remarkable People Podcast. Listen, do, repeat. For life.